Welcome back to Sleep Theories, where we dive deep into the mysteries that lurk beneath the surface of our world. Tonight's story comes from a former contractor who worked on one of the most ambitious scientific projects of our time, or so he thought. What he discovered beneath the Pacific waves will make you question everything you know about government transparency and the true purpose of our most advanced monitoring systems. Before we begin, I want to thank Wolf Hart 3085 for the video suggestion, and if you enjoy these stories, please like and subscribe to Sleep Theories and leave your video ideas in the comments below. Now, let's descend into the depths of deception. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what I saw during my 5 years working on the Ocean Observatory's initiative at Axial Seamount, 300 miles off the coast of Oregon. Everyone thinks they know the story. Scientists wired an underwater volcano to the internet, creating the world's most sophisticated real-time geological monitoring system. They even predicted eruptions with stunning accuracy. The media called it a triumph of human ingenuity over nature's chaos. They were wrong about everything. I was hired in March 2010 as a Level 2 technician, specialising in deep-sea cable installation and maintenance. Fresh out of technical college, I thought I'd landed the job of a lifetime. The Ocean Observatory's initiative was being hailed as revolutionary. The $386 million project funded by the National Science Foundation to create a permanent underwater laboratory on Axial Seamount, an active volcano rising from the Juan de Fuca Ridge. The recruitment pitch was intoxicating. We were going to monitor every tremor, every gas emission, every microscopic change in water temperature. When Axial inevitably erupted again, it had blown in 1998 and was overdue, we'd capture data in real time through fibre optic cables stretching from the seafloor to shore. Scientists would finally understand how underwater volcanoes worked, potentially revolutionising our knowledge of plate tectonics and ocean chemistry. At least that's what they told us. The first red flag should have been the security clearance requirements. For a civilian science project, they asked an unusual number of questions about my family, my finances, my political affiliations. The background check took 3 months, longer than some military positions. When I asked why such extensive vetting was necessary for monitoring a volcano, my supervisor, a weathered engineer named Rick Martinez, just shrugged. Government money, government rules, he said. You want to work 2,900 meters underwater on $1 million equipment. They want to know you won't sell secrets to the Russians. It seemed reasonable at the time. Chapter 1. The Signals No One Talks About. Axial Seamount sits like a massive underwater mountain, its summit caldera stretching nearly 3 kilometers across. The volcano rises 1,100 meters from the surrounding seafloor, topped by hydrothermal vents that spew superheated water rich in minerals and exotic bacteria. It's an alien landscape of chimney formations, lava flows, and geological features that exist nowhere else on Earth. Our job was to turn this natural laboratory into the world's most sophisticated monitoring station. Teams of technicians worked in rotating shifts, some aboard research vessels, others in the main control center at the University of Washington. I split my time between both, but my specialty was the control room, monitoring the constant stream of data flowing through those fibre optic cables from 300 miles offshore. The control room hummed with quiet efficiency. Banks of monitors displayed real-time seismic readings, water temperature fluctuations, chemical compositions, and pressure variations. During my night shifts, I'd watch the gentle waves of normal geological activity, the slow breathing of a sleeping giant. Occasionally, small earthquake swarms would light up the displays and brief fireworks of yellow and orange traces. It was during one of these quiet nights in September 2010 that I first noticed something unusual. I was reviewing the day's sonar data when I spotted an anomaly buried in the routine readings. Most sonar contacts showed the expected geological features: rock formations, thermal vents, the occasional school of deep-sea fish. But this contact was different. It appeared as a series of regular geometric patterns moving across the seafloor near the northeastern rim of the caldera. The shapes were too uniform, too purposeful to be natural. They moved in coordinated formations at speeds that made no biological sense for deep-sea creatures. Most puzzling, they appeared and disappeared without warning, as if they could somehow mask their presence from our sophisticated detection equipment. I flagged the anomaly for review, as protocol required. The next morning I approached Martinez with the data. "Probably just equipment interference," he said, without looking at the printouts. "These systems are still being calibrated. Discard anything that doesn't fit baseline parameters." "But the patterns are consistent," I insisted. "They show up in the same areas, following similar movement profiles. Shouldn't we at least—" "Jake." Martinez's tone carried a warning. "Your job is to monitor volcanic activity, geology, hydrothermal vents. Stick to what's on your clipboard, and you'll do fine here." I let it drop, but I didn't forget. Over the following weeks, I began paying closer attention to the anomalous contacts. They appeared most frequently during the early morning hours, between 2 and 5 a.m. Pacific time, when most of the day shift scientists had gone home. The objects, and I was increasingly convinced they were objects, not natural phenomena, seemed to patrol the caldera's perimeter with methodical precision. More disturbing were the conversations I began overhearing. During shift changes, when technicians thought no one was listening, I caught fragments of hushed discussions. Movement at Sector 7 again. Navy wants the thermal signatures isolated. Cleared to depth 2,800, but no deeper. One evening in October, I was working late when 2 senior technicians entered the adjacent monitoring station. They spoke in low voices, but sound carried in the quiet facility. "Traffic's picking up at the rim," one said. "3rd time this week." "Same pattern as before?" "Yeah, but they're staying deeper now, almost like they know we're watching. Command says to log everything but don't report unless specifically asked." "What do you think they are?" A long pause. "Above my pay grade, but they're not fish, and they're sure as hell not rocks." I pretended to focus on my screens while straining to hear more, but they moved to a different section of the facility. That night I went through every piece of sonar data from the past month, looking for patterns I might have missed. What I found changed everything. The anomalous contacts weren't random. They followed predictable routes around the caldera, maintaining specific depths and intervals. More importantly, they seemed to respond to our monitoring activities. When we conducted active sonar sweeps, the objects would disappear for hours, only to resume their patterns when we switched back to passive detection. It was as if something down there was studying us as intently as we were studying it. The realization sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the cold control room. I began to understand why my background check had been so thorough, why civilian technicians needed security clearances for a simple geological monitoring project. We weren't just watching Axial's Seamount. Something else was watching it too, and the government knew. Chapter 2. A Classified Layer. The 2011 axial eruption should have been our moment of triumph. Scientists had predicted it based on the steady inflation of the caldera floor, growing seismic activity, and changing chemistry in the hydrothermal vents. When the volcano began erupting on April 6, 2011, it seemed to validate everything the Ocean Observatory's initiative represented. I was on duty in the control room when the eruption began. The seismic displays exploded with activity as magma broke through the seafloor, creating new lava flows across the caldera. Water temperature sensors registered dramatic spikes as superheated volcanic material met cold seawater. It was exactly what we'd trained for, a real-time view of one of nature's most powerful forces. For the first 18 hours, everything proceeded according to our models. The public data feed streamed live volcanic activity to universities and research institutions worldwide. News outlets praised the project's success, interviewing scientists who described the unprecedented detail of our observations. Then, at 11:43 p.m. on April 7th, everything went dark. The official explanation came swiftly. Equipment failure due to extreme thermal conditions. All public data feeds were suspended while technicians assessed damage to critical monitoring systems. The blackout would last exactly 24 hours, after which normal operations would resume. But I was in the control room when the blackout began, and I saw what really happened. At 11:43 p.m, every display in the facility suddenly switched from live feeds to a static blue screen reading system maintenance, authorized personnel only. But our internal monitoring systems never stopped working. I could still see the seismic traces, still monitor the fibre optic cable integrity, still access the raw data streams flowing from Axial's sensors. What I saw during those 24 hours defied explanation. Instead of the expected volcanic signatures, the chaotic, powerful, but ultimately predictable patterns of erupting magma, the seismic displays showed something else entirely. For 6 hours, from midnight to 6 a.m. on April 8th, the readings looked less like geological activity and more like controlled detonations. The energy releases were too precise, too coordinated, occurring at regular intervals in geometric patterns across the seafloor. More unsettling were the sonar contacts. During the height of what everyone believed was a volcanic eruption, I tracked dozens of large objects moving through the water column at impossible speeds. They weren't volcanic debris. They moved with purpose, following coordinated flight paths that defied the chaotic currents of an active eruption zone. Around 3 a.m, Martinez appeared beside my workstation. I hadn't heard him enter. "Quiet night," he said, though the displays showed anything but quiet. "The readings don't match the official eruption models," I replied carefully. "Should I log these discrepancies?" Martinez was silent for a long moment, studying the screens. Finally he said, "Jake, you've got a good eye and a sharp mind. That's going to serve you well in this job, or it's going to get you in serious trouble. The choice is yours." He walked away without another word. At 6 a.m. sharp, the displays returned to normal volcanic signatures, the chaotic, powerful patterns we expected from an erupting underwater volcano. The transformation was instantaneous, as if someone had thrown a switch. For the remaining 18 hours of the blackout, Axial behaved exactly like a textbook eruption. When public data feeds resumed at 11:43 p.m. on April 8th, scientists worldwide celebrated the unprecedented success of real-time volcanic monitoring. Papers were written, awards were given, and funding was secured for expanded operations. No one mentioned the 6 hours of impossible readings. No one discussed the coordinated detonation patterns or the high-speed objects. The official record showed a perfect volcanic eruption, captured in exquisite detail by cutting-edge monitoring technology. But I'd seen the raw data. I knew the public was getting a sanitized version of events. The next morning, Martinez pulled me aside before my shift began. "You did good work last night," he said. "Stayed focused, followed protocols. That's the kind of professionalism this project needs." "What about the anomalous readings? Shouldn't we investigate?" "There were no anomalous readings," Martinez interrupted. "The eruption proceeded exactly as predicted. Our equipment performed flawlessly, and the data confirmed our models. That's the official report, and that's what goes in your logs." He paused, studying my face. "Jake, this project is bigger than any of us. There are aspects of it that go beyond volcanic monitoring, aspects that require the highest levels of security clearance. You don't have that clearance, which means you don't need to know about those aspects. Your job is to monitor the volcano. Do that job well, and you'll have a long, successful career here. Start asking questions about things outside your purview, and you'll find yourself looking for work somewhere else." The message was clear. I had a choice: stay quiet and keep my job, or dig deeper and face consequences I probably couldn't imagine. I should have walked away then. I should have transferred to another project, found work with a different contractor, maybe gone back to school. Instead, I did something far more dangerous. I started paying attention to everything they didn't want me to notice. Chapter 3. The Navy's Secret Interest. The Naval Undersea Warfare Centre had an innocuous presence at our facility. 3 junior officers who officially served as liaison personnel to ensure military oceanographic interests were represented in the project. They kept to themselves, occupying a small office suite in the administrative wing, supposedly reviewing data for navigational hazard assessment. It was a lie. Over the months following the 2011 eruption, I began noticing patterns that revealed the Navy's true involvement. Military personnel had unrestricted access to all our monitoring systems, including feeds that were supposed to be classified above their clearance levels. They maintained their own data storage systems, parallel to but separate from the civilian project databases. Most tellingly, they received real-time notifications for specific types of anomalous readings, the same anomalies Martinez kept telling us to ignore. The breakthrough came in November 2011, when I accidentally received a misdirected email meant for Martinez. The sender was identified only as NUWC7, and the subject line read Axial Energy Pattern Analysis, Confidential. The email contained a series of technical diagrams that made my hand shake as I scrolled through them. The images showed Axial's caldera from above, overlaid with concentric circles and mathematical calculations. But these weren't geological surveys, they were blast radius projections. The calculations modelled various scenarios of controlled energy release at specific points around the volcano. Each scenario included projected shockwave propagation patterns, tsunami generation models, and potential damage assessments for coastal cities throughout the Pacific Rim. Seattle, Portland, San Francisco, Los Angeles, even cities as distant as Tokyo and Sydney were included in the analysis. One diagram particularly stood out. It showed a cross-section of Axial's magma chamber with multiple marked optimal insertion points for what the technical notes described as kinetic penetrator systems. The accompanying text discussed sympathetic resonance triggering and cascading structural failure protocols. They were studying how to weaponize the volcano. I printed the email before it could be recalled, hiding the papers in my personal locker. Within an hour, my computer access was temporarily suspended for routine security updates. When it was restored the next day, the email had vanished without a trace. But I had the printouts, and I began to understand the true scope of what we were dealing with. The Ocean Observatory's initiative wasn't just monitoring Axial Seamount. It was providing targeting data for a weapons system that could trigger artificial eruptions. The fibre optic cables didn't just carry information, they could potentially deliver signals to devices planted throughout the volcano structure. The anomalous readings we kept detecting weren't equipment malfunctions or unknown sea creatures. They were test runs. Over the following weeks, I paid closer attention to the Navy personnel. Commander Patricia Walsh, the senior liaison officer, made regular visits to our control room, always during night shifts when fewer civilian staff were present. She would study our displays for specific types of seismic activity, taking notes on handheld devices that were never connected to our networks. One evening in December, I overheard a conversation between Walsh and two of her subordinates in the hallway outside the control room. "The resonance patterns are getting more consistent," one officer reported. "Response time has improved by 40% since the last test." "What about depth penetration?" Walsh asked. "Still limited to the upper magma chamber, but we're working on deeper insertion protocols. The new system should reach the main reservoir by next spring." "Good. Washington wants operational capability within 18 months. This can't remain a research project forever." "What about the civilian contractors? Some of them are asking questions." "Martinez has been briefed on information security protocols. Anyone who becomes a problem will be transferred to other projects. We can't afford security breaches this close to operational status." They moved away before I could hear more, but their words echoed in my mind for days. Operational status. They weren't just studying Axial, they were preparing to use it. The implications were staggering. An artificially triggered eruption at Axial could generate massive tsunamis that would devastate the entire Pacific coastline. Cities would be destroyed, millions would die, and the perpetrators could claim it was a natural disaster, the perfect, untraceable weapon, and I was helping them build it. That night, I went home and researched everything I could find about underwater volcanic weaponization. Most sources dismissed the concept as science fiction, but a few academic papers hinted at theoretical possibilities. A 1950s military study had examined using nuclear weapons to trigger earthquakes along fault lines. More recently, researchers had noted the potential for focused energy systems to destabilize underwater geological formations. The technology existed. The delivery systems were in place. All they needed was detailed targeting data, exactly what we were providing through the Ocean Observatory's initiative. I realized I was watching the development of a weapon that could reshape global power dynamics. nations with access to such technology wouldn't need traditional military forces to threaten their enemies. They could simply trigger natural disasters that would be impossible to trace back to human intervention. The question wasn't whether the Navy would eventually use their volcanic weapon. It was when, and against whom. Chapter 4. The Disappearing Evidence. By early 2012, I had become obsessed with documenting everything I could about the project's hidden military applications. I started staying late after my shifts, using my legitimate access to copy files I probably shouldn't have been reviewing. I created encrypted backups on external drives, stored in a safety deposit box my supervisors didn't know about. The deeper I dug, the more disturbing the picture became. Financial records showed the Ocean Observatory's initiative was receiving funding from sources far beyond the National Science Foundation. The Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency had contributed $47 million through shell contractors. The Central Intelligence Agency had provided technical consultation services, worth another $23 million. Even NASA had quietly transferred funds, ostensibly for astrobiology research, related to the hydrothermal vent ecosystems. But it was the technical specifications that truly frightened me. Buried in subsystem documentation, I found references to variable acoustic resonance modules and deep penetration kinetic systems that had no apparent connection to volcanic monitoring. Cross-referencing part numbers led to defense contractors specializing in weapons guidance systems and seismic warfare applications. Most damning were the test logs. Starting in late 2011, teams had been conducting monthly calibration procedures that involved sending specific low-frequency acoustic pulses through the monitoring network. These pulses were precisely tuned to match the resonant frequencies of Axial's magma chamber, frequencies that could theoretically be used to destabilize the volcano's internal structure. Each test was more sophisticated than the last. Early procedures lasted only minutes and produced minimal seismic response. By the spring of 2012, the tests were running for hours and generating measurable tremors throughout the caldera. The progression was clear. They were learning to control the volcano's behavior through targeted acoustic manipulation. I documented everything, building a comprehensive archive of evidence that proved the Ocean Observatory's initiative was a cover for the development of volcanic warfare capabilities. My safety deposit box filled with hard drives containing thousands of files, photographs, and recorded conversations captured during late-night shifts. But I wasn't the only one who had noticed the project's true nature. In May 2012, I learned about Thomas Garrett, a former Level 3 technician who had worked on the initial cable installation. Garrett had left the project abruptly in early 2011, officially due to a family medical emergency. According to office rumours, he'd been asking too many questions about the Navy's involvement and had become increasingly vocal about his concerns. I tracked down Garrett's contact information and arranged to meet him at a diner in Portland, far from our facility. He was a nervous man in his 50s, constantly checking over his shoulder and speaking in hushed tones. "You need to be very careful," he warned me. "These people don't mess around." I tried to go public with what I knew, and they destroyed my life. Garrett told me about his attempts to contact journalists and government watchdog organisations. In every case, his stories were dismissed as the ramblings of a disgruntled former employee. Reporters who initially showed interest would suddenly stop returning his calls. Government offices would forward his complaints to the very agencies he was trying to expose. "The system is designed to protect itself," he explained. "They've got people everywhere, journalists, politicians, oversight committees. Anyone who might cause problems is either bought off, discredited, or neutralised." He showed me a folder of documents he had managed to save before leaving the project. Many were similar to what I had found, but some contained information that made me realise the true scope of the programme. Axial Seamount wasn't the only volcanic system being weaponised. Similar monitoring networks were being installed at underwater volcanoes throughout the Pacific Ring of Fire. Hawaii's Kilauea, Indonesia's Krakatoa, Japan's Mount Fuji, dozens of sites were being prepared for potential artificial triggering. "They're building a global arsenal," Garrett said. "Any country that steps out of line can be hit with a natural disaster. that can't be traced back to us. It's the perfect weapon, untraceable, devastating, and completely deniable. But Garrett's most chilling revelation was about the timeline. They're planning to go operational within 2 years, he told me. The first tests will be small, maybe triggering minor eruptions to fine-tune their systems. But once they've perfected the technology, they'll have the power to reshape the entire global balance. When I returned to work the next Monday, I found my access credentials had been revoked. Martinez explained it was routine security maintenance, but I noticed additional military personnel around the facility. My workstation had been relocated to a different section of the control room, and my assignment had been changed from monitoring to administrative data entry. The message was clear. They knew I had been investigating. Over the following weeks, I was gradually isolated from sensitive operations. My shift assignments kept me away from the control room during critical monitoring periods. Technical discussion stopped when I entered rooms. Former colleagues began treating me with polite distance, but I wasn't ready to give up yet. Using my remaining access, I made one final attempt to gather evidence. Working during a late-night shift in June 2012, I accessed the archived anomaly recordings I had been documenting for nearly 2 years. The files contained hundreds of hours of acoustic data from the mysterious contacts around Axial's caldera. What I found in those recordings changed everything I thought I understood about the project. The anomalous acoustic signatures weren't random noise or equipment interference. They were structured, complex, and clearly artificial. More importantly, they showed signs of intelligence, response patterns that suggested intentional communication attempts. Something was trying to talk to us. The recordings contained sequences of precisely modulated tones, mathematical progressions, and repetitive patterns that resembled linguistic structures. Whatever was generating these signals was using increasingly sophisticated methods to get our attention, adapting its communication attempts based on our responses. I spent hours analysing the data, cross-referencing patterns and looking for linguistic structures. The deeper I went, the more convinced I became that we weren't just monitoring geological activity at Axial Seamount. We were in contact with something that lived there. The next morning I arrived at work to find security officers waiting at my desk. My access badge had been permanently revoked, my personal belongings had been packed into boxes, and I had been terminated for security violations. Martinez was apologetic but firm. "You're a good technician, Jake, but you've been asking questions outside your job description. That's not going to work in an environment like this." "What about the acoustic recordings?" I asked. "There's clear evidence of structured communication attempts. Whatever is down there is trying to establish contact." "There are no acoustic anomalies," Martinez replied. "Our equipment monitors volcanic activity. Nothing else. I suggest you focus on finding new employment rather than spreading conspiracy theories." As security escorted me from the building, I caught a glimpse of Commander Walsh watching from an upper floor window. Even from that distance, I could see the cold satisfaction in her expression. They had won this round, but I still had my safety deposit box full of evidence. I still knew the truth about what they were really doing at Axial Seamount, and I was determined to find a way to stop them. Chapter 5. The Breaking Point. Losing my job should have ended my involvement with the Ocean Observatories initiative, but it only strengthened my resolve to expose the truth. From my Portland apartment, I continued monitoring public data feeds and tracking news reports about the project. What I saw convinced me that the Navy was accelerating their timeline toward operational capability. The 2015 Axial eruption provided the perfect test case. Scientists had once again predicted the eruption based on steady caldera inflation and increasing seismic activity. When the volcano began erupting on April 24, 2015, the media celebrated another triumph of geological monitoring. Real-time data streams showed the eruption unfolding exactly as models predicted. But I knew better than to trust the public feeds. Using contacts I had maintained from my time on the project, I arranged access to military monitoring networks that provided a different view of events. What I saw during the first hours of the 2015 eruption confirmed my worst fears about the programme's true purpose. For 6 hours on April 24th, from 2 a.m. to 8 a.m. Pacific time, the real seismic data showed no volcanic activity whatsoever. Instead, the monitoring systems detected the same types of controlled detonation patterns I'd observed during the 2011 blackout. But this time, the patterns were more sophisticated, more precisely targeted, and far more powerful. The objects I'd been tracking since 2010 were more active than ever during these hours. Sonar contacts showed dozens of large craft moving through the water column around Axial's caldera, following coordinated flight paths that suggested a major operation was underway. Most disturbing were the acoustic communications. The structured signals I had discovered in 2012 had evolved into complex exchanges between multiple sources. The communication showed increasing urgency and sophistication, as if different groups were coordinating responses to the activity around the volcano. Then, at exactly 8 a.m, everything changed. The acoustic communication stopped abruptly. The mysterious sonar contacts vanished from detection. The controlled detonation pattern ceased, replaced by normal volcanic eruption signatures that continued for the next several days. It was as if someone had thrown a switch, transforming an artificial event into a natural eruption. The timing was too precise, too coordinated to be coincidental. When public data feeds resumed normal operation, they showed a perfect volcanic eruption that validated every prediction model. Scientists worldwide praised the unprecedented accuracy of their forecasting methods. Awards were presented, papers were published, and funding was secured for expanded monitoring networks. But the real story was hidden in those 6 hours of classified activity. Through my military contacts, I learned that Navy personnel had been placed on high alert throughout the Pacific Fleet during the eruption. Submarine patrols were increased around potential target areas. Special weapons teams were deployed to bases in Japan, South Korea, and the Philippines. They hadn't just been testing their volcanic triggering systems, they had been preparing for actual deployment. The realization that we were on the brink of a new form of warfare drove me to take desperate action. I contacted every journalist, government official, and international organisation I could reach, trying to expose the truth about the Ocean Observatory's initiative. The response was predictably discouraging. Mainstream media dismissed my claims as conspiracy theories. Government oversight committees forwarded my complaints to the very agencies I was trying to expose. International organisations expressed polite concern but took no substantive action. But I wasn't the only former contractor trying to sound the alarm. Through encrypted communication networks, I connected with other whistleblowers who had worked on similar projects around the Pacific Ring of Fire. Their stories followed familiar patterns. Civilian researchers recruited for scientific monitoring projects that turned out to be military weapons development programs. We formed a small but dedicated group focused on documenting and exposing the truth about volcanic warfare research. We shared evidence, coordinated investigations, and supported each other through the inevitable retaliation attempts. One member of our group, a former systems analyst named Rebecca Torres, had worked on the Hawaiian monitoring network. She provided evidence that Kilauea's recent eruption patterns were being artificially manipulated using acoustic resonance systems similar to those deployed at Axial. Another whistleblower, David Chen, had been involved in geological surveys of underwater volcanoes near Japan. His documents showed that dozens of potential triggering sites had been identified and prepared for weapons deployment. Together, we built a comprehensive picture of a global volcanic weapons program that could reshape international relations. The implications were staggering. Any nation could be targeted with untraceable natural disasters that would cause massive destruction while maintaining complete deniability for the perpetrators. But our investigations also revealed something else, evidence that we weren't the only intelligence involved in this underwater war. The acoustic communications I had documented at Axial weren't random attempts at contact. They were part of a sophisticated intelligence network that had been monitoring and responding to human activity around underwater volcanic sites for decades. Whatever was down there wasn't just observing our weapons development, it was actively interfering with our plans. The mysterious sonar contacts weren't alien visitors or unknown sea creatures. They were representatives of an intelligence that had been sharing the deep ocean with us far longer than we realized, and they were becoming increasingly concerned about our military activities in their domain. The realization that we were dealing with a three-way conflict between human nations, between surface and deep ocean intelligences, and between civilian and military interests, made the situation exponentially more dangerous. We weren't just building weapons that could destroy cities and kill millions of people. We were provoking a conflict with entities that control the deep ocean environment, essential to our planet's survival. And time was running out to prevent a catastrophe that could affect the entire human species. It's been 8 years since I was terminated from the Ocean Observatory's initiative, and the world has changed in ways that validate my worst predictions. Natural disasters have become increasingly frequent and devastating. Underwater volcanic activity has intensified around the Pacific Ring of Fire. Geopolitical tensions have escalated as nations struggle to understand the changing dynamics of oceanic warfare. The mainstream media still treats volcanic weaponization as science fiction, but those of us who worked on these projects know better. The technology is real, the weapons are operational, and they're being deployed with increasing frequency. The 2018 Indonesian tsunami that killed over 400 people, the seismic signature was consistent with artificial triggering. The 2019 volcanic activity in the Philippines that displaced hundreds of thousands, the timing coincided with major military exercises in the South China Sea. The 2021 eruptions in Iceland that disrupted global air travel. They occurred during a period of heightened tensions between NATO and Russia. Each event can be explained as natural geological activity, which is exactly the point. The perfect weapon leaves no fingerprints. But the most disturbing development has been the escalating conflict with the deep ocean intelligence I first detected in 2010. The acoustic communications have become increasingly urgent and widespread. The mysterious sonar contacts now appear at volcanic sites throughout the world's oceans, and their responses to human military activities have become more direct and aggressive. Recent satellite imagery shows massive disturbances around underwater volcanic sites that can't be explained by normal geological processes. Shipping lanes have been mysteriously disrupted by unexplained acoustic phenomena. Deep-sea mining operations have reported equipment failures that suggest deliberate sabotage. We're not just fighting each other anymore. We're fighting for control of an environment we barely understand, against entities we never knew existed. That's why I'm finally telling this story publicly. The few journalists and officials who listened to my earlier warnings have either been silenced, discredited, or transferred to positions where they can't cause problems. The oversight systems designed to prevent military abuses have been captured by the very agencies they're supposed to monitor. Traditional channels for exposing government wrongdoing have failed, but the truth has a way of surfacing, even from the deepest waters. Every classified document eventually gets leaked, every secret program eventually gets exposed, every cover-up eventually unravels. The Ocean Observatory's initiative was supposed to be a triumph of scientific cooperation and international collaboration. Instead, it became the foundation for a new form of warfare that threatens the stability of our entire planet. The deep ocean isn't empty space waiting for human exploitation. It's home to intelligences that have been sharing this world with us far longer than we've existed as a species. Our attempts to weaponize their environment haven't gone unnoticed, and their patience with our aggressive activities is running out. Every time I see news reports about increasing geological instability, I remember those mysterious acoustic communications, the increasingly urgent attempts at contact that we chose to ignore. Every time another natural disaster strikes with suspicious timing and location, I think about the weapon systems I helped install, and every time I look at the ocean, I wonder how much longer we have before the intelligence beneath the waves decides that humanity poses too great a threat to be tolerated. The fibre optic cables that connect Axial Seamount to the internet weren't just designed to carry data from the deep ocean to our monitoring stations. They were designed to carry signals in both directions, from our control centres to devices planted throughout the volcano's structure. If you ever wonder why they wired a volcano to the internet, remember this. Data can flow both ways, and sometimes the things we monitor start monitoring us back. The silent war beneath the waves has been going on for years. Most people don't know it exists because that's how the participants want it. Hidden beneath thousands of feet of water, disguised as natural phenomena, dismissed as conspiracy theories by those who benefit from the secrecy. But the war is real, the weapons are operational, and the stakes couldn't be higher. What happens next depends on whether humanity can find the wisdom to step back from the brink, before we trigger a conflict that none of us can survive. The deep ocean is vast, ancient, and patient. But patience, like pressure, has limits, and we may have already reached ours. What if the most powerful secret society in the world wasn't hiding their evil plans, but keeping something far worse from awakening? Tonight's chilling tale takes us deep into the redwood forests of California, where ancient rituals and modern power collide in ways you never imagined. Special thanks to Langalman for suggesting this spine-tingling concept. If you have ideas for future stories, drop them in the comments below. And if you're enjoying these midnight journeys into the unknown, don't forget to like and subscribe to Sleep Theories for more tales that blur the line between conspiracy and nightmare. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped between my electric bill and a stack of rejection letters from publishers who wouldn't touch my work anymore. Plain white paper, no return address, postmarked from San Francisco but feeling like it had travelled much farther than the 300 miles from the city. My name was written in careful block letters across the front. ALEXMORGAN. Nothing else. No apartment number, though whoever sent it knew exactly where to find me in this cramped studio above the Chinese restaurant on Divisadero Street. I'd been blacklisted for 18 months now, ever since I published that expose on Meridian Industries and their illegal arms deals with 3 different terror groups. The story won awards, toppled a senator, and destroyed my career in equal measure. Turns out some truths are too expensive for the media to handle. The lawsuit bankrupted the magazine, my editor disappeared into witness protection, and I became radioactive to every publication from the Chronicle to Mother Jones. But someone still thought I was worth reaching. Inside the envelope was a single sheet of cream-coloured paper, expensive stock, with an embossed header that made my hands shake. The Bohemian Club, San Francisco. Below that, an invitation written in the same careful script. Mr. Alex Morgan is cordially invited to attend the summer encampment at Bohemian Grove, Monte Rio, California, July 15th to 31st, 2024. Guest privileges have been arranged. Transportation and accommodation provided. This invitation is non-transferable and expires at sundown on July 15th. At the bottom, written in different handwriting, rushed, urgent, was a single line that would haunt me for weeks. This is your last chance to see the truth. Don't waste it. Bohemian Grove. I'd heard whispers, read the conspiracy theories, seen the grainy photos leaked over the years. Every July, the most powerful men in America, presidents, CEOs, generals, media moguls, retreated to 2,700 acres of ancient redwoods north of San Francisco for 2 weeks of what they called fellowship, what the rest of the world called the most secretive gathering of the American elite. No journalists allowed, no cameras, no women, no record of what happened behind those gates, except for the occasional leaked photo of men in robes standing before a massive owl statue, performing something called the cremation of care ceremony. Political theatre, most assumed. Rich men playing dress-up while they planned the next war or market crash. But this invitation was real. The paper felt authentic. The letterhead matched samples I'd seen in archived documents. Someone with serious connections wanted me inside those gates. The question was why. I spent 3 days researching everything I could find about the Grove. The official history spoke of artistic pursuits, informal talks, and male bonding among the country's leadership. The unofficial history painted darker pictures: secret deals, occult rituals, decisions that shaped global politics made during drunken conversations around campfires. The most disturbing accounts came from the few infiltrators who'd made it inside over the decades. They described the opening ceremony where members dressed as druids and burned an effigy called Care before a giant concrete owl. They spoke of lakeside talks where defence contractors pitched new weapons to Pentagon officials, of quiet conversations that preceded major policy announcements, of a casual corruption so normalised it felt like summer camp for sociopaths. But none of them had stayed long. Most were caught and expelled within days. The security was too tight, the members too paranoid, the stakes too high for any real investigation. Whoever sent this invitation was giving me something no journalist had ever possessed: legitimate access. The question was whether I was walking into the story of a lifetime or a trap that would finish what Meridian Industries had started. On the morning of July 14th, I made my decision. I packed light, a small camera hidden in my toiletry kit, a digital recorder disguised as an inhaler, a notebook I could claim was for poetry if questioned. Everything that might help me document what happened behind those gates. The invitation included a phone number. When I called, a woman's voice gave me an address in Santa Rosa and told me to be there by 6 p.m. sharp. No other details. No explanation of who had arranged this or what they expected in return. I drove north through wine country as the sun set, watching the hills turn gold and purple in the fading light. The address led to a small parking lot behind a defunct gas station. 3 black SUVs waited, engines running, windows tinted. A man in a plain suit approached my car before I'd even turned off the engine. "Morgan?" he asked. I nodded. "Leave your keys in the ignition. Someone will return your car when you're finished." "Finished with what?" He didn't answer, just opened the passenger door of the middle SUV and waited. I grabbed my bag and climbed in, noting the soundproof partition between front and back seats, the lack of door handles on the interior. Whatever was happening, there would be no turning back once we started moving. The drive took 40 minutes through increasingly dense forest. No conversation, no music, just the hum of tyres on asphalt and the gradual realisation that I was committing to something I didn't understand. My phone lost signal after the first 10 minutes. The windows were too dark to see landmarks. By the time we stopped, I had no idea where we were or how to get back. The gates of Bohemian Grove appeared suddenly in our headlights. Massive wooden barriers flanked by stone pillars, with the carved image of an owl watching from above. Guards emerged from hidden positions, checked documents, waved us through. The SUV followed a winding road deeper into the forest, past smaller camps with names like Hillbillies and Lost Angels painted on rustic signs. We stopped at a cluster of simple cabins near what appeared to be a lake. The man in the suit handed me a small leather folder. "Your documentation," he said. "You're a guest of the Mandalay camp. Keep your head down, your mouth shut, and your eyes open. Someone will contact you when it's time." Time for what? But he was already walking back to the SUV. I watched the taillights disappear into the trees, leaving me alone in the most secretive place in America with nothing but a fake identity, and questions I wasn't sure I wanted answered. Inside the leather folder was a camp roster listing me as a Morgan, Investment Banking, Chicago. Below that was a simple map of the Grove and a schedule of events. Tomorrow night was marked in red. Cremation of Care Ceremony, 9:30 p.m, Sacred Grove. At the bottom of the page, in the same urgent handwriting from the invitation, was one final note. "Watch for the second ceremony. That's where the real truth begins." The morning brought sounds I'd never expected to hear in such a place. Laughter, casual conversation, the clink of coffee cups on saucers. Looking out the window of my assigned cabin, I saw men who controlled trillions of dollars and millions of lives shuffling around in bathrobes and flip-flops like they were at a summer camp. Because that's exactly what it was, I realised. The most exclusive, powerful summer camp in the world. I dressed in the khakis and polo shirt that had been left in my closet, the Grove's unofficial uniform, and stepped outside to explore. The camp sprawled across the forest in a seemingly random pattern of paths and clearings, each dedicated to different groups with names that sounded like fraternity houses. Caveman, Silverado, Owl's Nest, Sons of Toil. At the central plaza I found what looked like a small town square, a dining hall large enough for hundreds, a stage for performances, a bar that was already serving despite the early hour. Men moved between these spaces with the easy familiarity of those who'd done this many times before. Some faces I recognised from television and magazine covers. Senators CEOS, a former Secretary of State. Others were anonymous but carried themselves with the quiet confidence that comes from wielding serious power. The strangest part was how normal it all felt. These were the people conspiracy theorists claimed ran secret cabals to control world events, and they were arguing about baseball scores and complaining about their golf games like any group of aging fraternity brothers. First time at the Grove? I turned to find a heavy-set man in his 60s, silver hair perfectly styled despite the casual setting. His face was familiar, but I couldn't place it immediately. "That obvious?" I asked. He laughed. "You've got that wide-eyed look. Everyone does their first time. I'm Bill. Been coming here for 23 years. Alex, investment banking. Right. Mandalay camp. Heard you were joining us. What brings you to our little retreat?" It was a casual question, but something in his tone suggested it wasn't casual at all. I'd prepared for this. "Market analysis consultant," I said. "Specialised in political risk assessment. Figured this might be a good place to network." Bill nodded slowly. "Indeed it is. You'll want to catch tonight's ceremony if you haven't seen it before. Quite a spectacle. Been the same for nearly a century now. The owl thing, cremation of care. Beautiful tradition. Helps everyone leave their worries behind, focus on fellowship." He paused, studying my face. "Though I suspect you might find other aspects of our gathering more professionally relevant." Before I could ask what he meant, Bill was walking away, leaving me with the distinct impression that I'd just passed some kind of test. I spent the day observing, noting the casual interactions between men whose public relationships were supposedly adversarial. A Democratic senator sharing drinks with a Republican defense contractor, a tech CEO deep in conversation with someone I was pretty sure ran the NSA, a former president holding court near the lake, surrounded by media executives who hung on his every word. This was where real policy got made, I realised. Not in committee meetings or official negotiations, but in these informal moments between men who'd known each other for decades. The Grove was a lubricant for American power, a place where opposing sides could find common ground away from cameras and constituents. As afternoon turned to evening, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations became more hushed, more urgent. Staff members appeared with cases of equipment I couldn't identify. The lake area was cordoned off with rope barriers. Whatever was happening tonight, it was bigger than casual networking. At sunset, I joined the stream of men walking toward the sacred grove, a natural amphitheatre carved into the hillside dominated by the famous owl statue. 40 feet tall, carved from concrete, with burning eyes that watched over everything. Hundreds of folding chairs faced a small stage where men in hooded robes were preparing props I couldn't make out in the growing darkness. The ceremony began with music. A choir hidden in the trees, singing something that sounded like a funeral dirge. Then came the procession. 24 men in flowing robes, carrying torches, escorting what appeared to be a small coffin draped in black cloth. A voice boomed from speakers hidden throughout the forest, narrating the death of Care and its cremation before the great owl. The robed figures placed the coffin on a pyre and set it ablaze while the choir reached a crescendo. Flames leaped toward the owl's glowing eyes as hundreds of the world's most powerful men watched in reverent silence. It should have been absurd. Grown men playing dress-up, performing amateur theatre in the woods. Instead, It felt genuinely eerie. Something about the ancient trees, the flickering shadows, the synchronized movement of so many people participating in a ritual most of them probably didn't fully understand. Then the lights went out. Not just the ceremonial flames, everything. The owl's eyes went dark, the hidden speakers went silent, even the subtle path lighting I'd barely noticed disappeared. We were plunged into absolute darkness. Hundreds of men sitting in chairs carved into a hillside with no way to see where they were going. But instead of panic or confusion, there was silence. Complete unnatural silence. No one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe. It was as if the entire gathering had been frozen in place. I waited for someone to call for help, for flashlights to appear, for the normal response to a power outage. Instead, I heard something that made the hair on my arms stand up. Footsteps. Measured, deliberate, moving through the crowd with impossible precision despite the darkness. The footsteps stopped near the front of the amphitheatre. Then came a voice, speaking in what sounded like Latin, words I couldn't understand but that seemed to resonate in my chest. Other voices joined in, creating a chant that built and built until it felt like the forest itself was vibrating with sound. This wasn't part of the official ceremony, this was something else entirely. The chanting stopped as abruptly as it had begun. A few seconds later the lights returned. Owl's eyes blazing, speakers crackling back to life, the master of ceremonies continuing his narration as if nothing had happened. The spell was broken, men began talking and moving again. The formal ceremony concluded with applause and casual conversation. But as we filed out of the sacred grove, I noticed something that chilled me. At least 24 men weren't heading back to the camps with everyone else. Instead, they were walking deeper into the forest, following a path I hadn't noticed before. All of them carried small flashlights, and all of them moved with the purposeful direction of people who knew exactly where they were going. I hung back, letting the main crowd pass, then followed the breakaway group at a distance. They were easy to track. The flashlight beams bobbed through the trees like fireflies, leading toward a part of the grove I hadn't seen on any map. The path wound uphill for nearly half a mile before opening into a smaller clearing I would never have found on my own. Here, hidden from the main camp by dense forest, was a second amphitheatre. Older, more primitive, carved from natural rock formations rather than built from concrete and steel. At the centre stood not an owl but a stone altar, covered with symbols I didn't recognise. The 24 men formed a circle around it, no longer in ceremonial robes but in simple black clothing. They were chanting again, but this time I could make out some of the words. English mixed with Latin, speaking of binding and containment, of keeping something sleeping, of maintaining the barriers that held back chaos. As they chanted, one man stepped forward with something I definitely hadn't expected to see. A wooden crate, old and weathered, marked with symbols and what appeared to be a date from the 1940s. This was the real ceremony. Everything at the sacred grove had been theatre for the masses. This was why I'd been invited, why someone wanted a journalist to witness what happened in the shadows of America's most secretive gathering. I pressed closer, trying to see what was in the crate, but the trees blocked my view. All I could make out were the chanted words, growing more urgent now, in the sense that something ancient and dangerous was being carefully, deliberately contained. Then one of the men looked directly at me. The man who spotted me was younger than the others, maybe 45, with the lean build of someone who stayed in shape despite spending his days behind a desk. In the flickering torchlight, I couldn't make out his face clearly, but his posture suggested military training. He raised a hand and the chanting stopped instantly. "We have a visitor," he said, voice carrying easily across the clearing. I considered running, but there was nowhere to go. The path back was too narrow, too winding, and I'd never find my way in the dark. Instead, I stepped forward into the light, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "Alex Morgan," I said. "Mandalay Camp, You were just following us," the man interrupted. "Question is why?" An older man emerged from the circle, someone I now recognised as a former defence secretary, whose tenure had spanned 3 administrations. His presence here transformed this from concerning to terrifying. These weren't just wealthy eccentrics playing games. These were people who controlled military budgets and intelligence operations. "Show him," the Defence Secretary said simply. Two men stepped aside, giving me a clear view of the stone altar. The surface was covered with carved symbols that looked far older than anything else in the grove, spirals and geometric patterns that seemed to shift in the torchlight. The wooden crate sat at the centre, its lid partially open to reveal something that gleamed metallic in the flickering light. "Do you know what you're looking at, Mr. Morgan?" the Defence Secretary asked. I shook my head, not trusting my voice. "Project Owl," he continued, "started in 1943, continued in various forms ever since. The Grove isn't just a social club, it's a containment facility." "Containment for what?" The younger man laughed, but there was no humour in it. "You wouldn't believe us if we told you. Hell, most of the members don't know. They think they're here for networking and male bonding. The cremation of care is just pageantry to them, a quaint tradition with symbolic meaning. But the real ceremony," I gestured toward the altar, "is about keeping something very old, very powerful and very dangerous from waking up," the Defence Secretary finished. "The owl isn't a symbol we worship, Mr. Morgan. It's a prison we maintain." They were all watching me now, measuring my reaction, waiting to see how I'd process what they were telling me. Part of me wanted to laugh. This sounded like the fever dreams of conspiracy theorists, ancient evils and shadow governments and occult containment protocols. But the setting was too real, the participants too credible, the ritual I'd witnessed too elaborate to be fiction. "What's in the crate?" I asked. "The original binding artifacts," said a woman's voice from behind me. I spun around to find someone who definitely hadn't been there moments before. A woman in her 70s, silver hair pulled back severely, wearing clothes that managed to look both practical and expensive. Her presence violated everything I knew about the Grove's men-only policy. "Eleanor Hartwell," she said, extending a hand. "I've been managing Project Owl since 1987. Women aren't allowed. In the social aspects, no. But some secrets are too important for gender politics." She moved past me to examine the crate's contents. These were recovered from a Nazi expedition to Tibet in 1943. The SS Ahnenerbe thought they'd found artifacts that could summon and control ancient powers. They were half right. She lifted something from the crate, a metal disc covered with the same spiralling symbols as the altar, but these seemed to move on their own, shifting and changing as I watched. "The Tibetan monks who originally possessed these weren't trying to summon anything," Eleanor continued. "They were trying to keep something asleep. When Hitler's occultists broke the original binding, they didn't gain power. They released something that had been contained for centuries." "What kind of something?" the Defence Secretary answered. "Call it what you like. Ancient god, interdimensional entity, primordial force of chaos. The names don't matter. What matters is what it does when it's free." He gestured, and one of the other men brought out a tablet computer incongruous in this setting of torches and stone altars. The screen showed a map of the world with red markers scattered across it. "Every time the binding weakens, we see spikes in seemingly random catastrophic events," he explained. "Political assassinations, market crashes, natural disasters, terrorist attacks. Not caused directly, but influenced. Chaos spreads like a virus when certain barriers are down. The Grove was established here because of the natural properties of these particular redwoods," Eleanor added. "Old growth forests have natural resonance with certain types of, let's call them spiritual phenomena. The founding members didn't understand the science, but they recognized the effect. The annual gathering, the rituals, the focused attention of powerful minds, it all serves to reinforce the containment. And the cremation of care is a distraction," the younger man said. "Theatre for the masses while we handle the real work. Most of the members genuinely believe they're here for fellowship and networking. The inner circle knows better." I looked around the group, trying to count how many people were part of this inner circle. Maybe 30 total, out of the thousands who'd attended Grove encampments over the decades. A shadow organisation within a secret society, managing what they claimed was an existential threat to human civilization. "Why tell me this?" I asked. "Why invite a journalist?" Eleanor and the Defence Secretary exchanged glances. Something passed between them, a decision being made in real time. Because we're dying off, Eleanor said finally. The knowledge, the responsibility, the burden, it's all been passed down through personal relationships for 80 years. But the world has changed. The people with the power and resources to maintain the containment aren't necessarily the people we can trust with the truth. New money doesn't understand old responsibilities, the Defense Secretary added. Tech billionaires, crypto moguls, social media executives, they have the influence we need, but they think everything can be solved with apps and algorithms. They don't believe in things that can't be quantified. So you need documentation, I realised. A record of what really happens here. Insurance in case the oral tradition breaks down. Exactly, Eleanor confirmed. But it has to be someone outside the power structure. Someone with credibility and investigative skills. Someone who's already proven they'll publish dangerous truths regardless of personal cost. She meant my Meridian Industries expose. This was why I'd been blacklisted and then mysteriously invited. They needed a journalist who demonstrated willingness to sacrifice their career for a story. What happens if the binding fails completely? I asked. The group fell silent. Finally, the younger man spoke. Look at any period of sustained global chaos in human history. The fall of Rome, the Black Death, the World Wars, the collapse of the Soviet Union. Times when multiple systems failed simultaneously, when cause and effect stopped making sense, when it felt like the world was coming apart at the seams. Those were natural historical processes. Were they? Eleanor interrupted. Or were they what happens when humanity loses the ability to maintain certain spiritual defences? The monks who originally bound this thing warned that it feeds on conflict and confusion. The more chaos it causes, the stronger it becomes, until the binding fails entirely. She returned the metal disc to the crate and closed the lid carefully. The ceremony you just witnessed reinforces the containment for another year, she said, but each time it gets harder. The original artifacts are degrading, the knowledge is fragmenting, and the world is changing in ways that make traditional approaches less effective. How long do we have? Unknown, the Defense Secretary admitted. Could be decades, could be years, could be tomorrow if something goes wrong. That's why we need someone on the outside, someone who can document not just what we do, but why we do it. Insurance for the future. As if summoned by his words, a low rumble echoed through the forest. Not thunder, the sky was clear. Something deeper, more primal, like the earth itself was groaning. The torches flickered, and for a moment the carved symbols on the altar seemed to glow with their own light. Then everything went still again. Time to go, Eleanor said quietly. The ceremony's complete, but the effect can be unpredictable for the first few hours. The group began dispersing, each member taking a different path back through the forest. Within minutes, I was alone with Eleanor and the Defense Secretary, the altar dark and silent again. There's more to see, Eleanor told me, but not tonight. Tomorrow, if you're serious about this responsibility, we'll show you the archives, the complete record of Project Owl going back to its inception. And if I'm not serious? Then you'll have an interesting story about rich men playing games in the woods, the Defense Secretary said, which is what 90% of the attendees would tell you anyway. They walked away in different directions, leaving me standing alone beside the stone altar. The forest felt different now. Not threatening exactly, but aware, as if something vast and patient was watching from between the trees, held in check by forces I was only beginning to understand. I found my way back to Mandalay Camp by following the distant sound of laughter from the main plaza. Men were still awake, drinking and talking around campfires, processing the evening's official ceremony. To them, it had been a meaningful but ultimately symbolic ritual. They had no idea what had happened in the hidden clearing, no sense that their casual gathering served a purpose beyond networking and tradition. Back in my cabin, I sat on the narrow bed and tried to process what I'd experienced. Every instinct I'd developed as a journalist screamed that this was elaborate nonsense. Powerful people telling themselves comforting stories about their importance, dressing up their influence in mystical language to avoid confronting the mundane reality of politics and economics. But the metal disc had moved on its own. The forest had responded to the completion of their ritual, and the people involved weren't the kind who needed to invent elaborate fantasies to feel important. They already controlled most of the world's power and resources. Either I'd stumbled into the most sophisticated hoax in human history, or I'd been invited to document something that made every conspiracy theory I'd ever dismissed seem quaint by comparison. Tomorrow I'd get to see the archives. Tomorrow I'd learn whether Project Owl was an elaborate delusion or the most important secret in the world. Either way, my life as I knew it was over. I barely slept. Every sound in the forest seemed amplified. Branches creaking in the wind, night birds calling to each other, the distant murmur of late-night conversations from other camps. When I finally drifted off near dawn, my dreams were filled with spinning metal discs and watching eyes carved from stone. Eleanor found me at breakfast, appearing beside my table in the dining hall as if she'd materialised from thin air. In daylight, she looked like any other well-preserved socialite who might attend charity galas in Pacific Heights. The kind of woman whose presence at an all-male retreat would be explained as someone's eccentric aunt, who'd been grandfathered in through family connections. "Ready for the historical tour?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me. "Is that what we're calling it? The other guests think you're researching the Grove's role in American political history, which isn't entirely untrue." She sipped her coffee, eyes scanning the dining hall. "Most of them will be occupied with golf and lake activities today. Perfect time for a deeper education." We walked through the main camp area, past men reading newspapers and debating policy like they were at any expensive resort. Eleanor kept up a stream of casual conversation about Grove traditions and notable members, playing her part as tour guide. But I noticed she was leading us away from the popular areas, towards sections of the forest I hadn't seen before. "The Grove covers nearly 3,000 acres, she explained as we walked. "Most guests never venture beyond the central few hundred. Why would they? The camps, the lake, the dining facilities, everything they need for their retreat is concentrated in one area. But the rest of the property serves other purposes." We'd been walking for almost 20 minutes when she stopped beside what appeared to be a maintenance shed. Weathered wood siding, corrugated metal roof, the kind of utilitarian structure that becomes invisible once you've seen it. Eleanor produced a key and opened the padlock on the door. Inside, the shed was bigger than it appeared from outside, extending back into the hillside. What I'd taken for a simple storage building was actually a facade hiding a much larger underground facility. Fluorescent lights flickered on as we descended a concrete staircase that went down much deeper than should have been possible. "Built during the Cold War," Eleanor explained, her voice echoing in the narrow stairwell. "Officially, it's an emergency shelter for continuity of government operations. Unofficially, it houses the most complete archive of Project Owl materials outside of certain classified Pentagon files." The stairs ended at a steel door marked with radiation warnings and biohazard symbols. Eleanor placed her palm on a scanner that seemed decades newer than the rest of the facility. The door slid open with a hydraulic hiss, revealing something that took my breath away. The archive stretched out in all directions, a vast underground chamber carved from the bedrock beneath the grove. Metal shelving units reached toward a ceiling lost in shadows, each one packed with boxes, files, artifacts and equipment I couldn't begin to identify. Climate control systems hummed quietly, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity for materials that spanned nearly 8 decades of secret research. "Welcome to the real history of the 20th century, Eleanor said. She led me past shelves of documents in German, Russian, Chinese, and languages I didn't recognise. Maps marked with symbols similar to what I'd seen on the altar. Photographs of archaeological expeditions to remote locations around the world. Technical specifications for devices that looked like they belonged in science fiction movies. After we recovered the original Nazi materials in 1943, President Roosevelt authorised a classified research program, Eleanor explained, pulling a thick file from one of the shelves. The scientists involved were initially sceptical. Einstein himself consulted on the project for 6 months before concluding that the artefacts operated according to principles beyond current physics. She opened the file, revealing handwritten notes in what I recognised as Einstein's distinctive script. Mathematical equations filled page after page, interspersed with frustrated observations about phenomena that violate fundamental assumptions about the nature of reality. What did he conclude? That the universe is far stranger than we assumed, and that consciousness might play a more active role in physical processes than anyone wanted to admit. Eleanor closed the Einstein file and pulled out another one marked Tibet Expedition 1944 to 1947. We sent teams back to find the original source of the artefacts, learn how the binding process actually worked. The photographs in this file showed Western archaeologists working alongside Tibetan monks in monasteries that looked untouched by modernity. But what caught my attention were the images of stone chambers carved deep into mountain faces, filled with artefacts identical to what I'd seen the night before. The monks weren't surprised to see us, Eleanor continued. They'd been expecting someone to come asking questions about what the Germans had stolen. According to their records, this wasn't the first time the binding had been broken and had to be re-established. How many times? At least 7 documented instances over the past millennium. Each time, the disruption led to a period of sustained chaos. Wars, plagues, social collapse. The monks developed their containment techniques through trial and error over centuries. She showed me translation documents, painstakingly decoded texts that described rituals similar to what I'd witnessed, but far more complex. The Tibetan methods involved dozens of practitioners working in carefully coordinated groups, maintaining the binding through constant vigilance and regular reinforcement ceremonies. The Grove's founders didn't understand the underlying principles, Eleanor admitted. They just knew that gathering powerful, influential people together for focused ritual activities seemed to have a stabilizing effect on certain phenomena. We moved deeper into the archive, past sections devoted to different decades of research. I saw files on the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam War, Watergate, the fall of the Berlin Wall, all marked with notations about containment stress and binding fluctuations. Major historical events correlate with weaknesses in the containment, Eleanor explained. Sometimes the stress is caused by the events themselves. Global conflicts generate the kind of chaos that feeds the entity. Sometimes it's the reverse. Containment failures create conditions that make conflicts more likely. Chicken and egg. Exactly. Which is why prevention became our focus rather than reaction. She stopped at a section of the archive devoted to technology development. Here were prototypes of devices that looked decades ahead of anything I'd seen in the outside world. Machines that supposedly measured spiritual resonance and metaphysical field fluctuations. Computer models attempting to quantify something that traditional science insisted didn't exist. The hardest part has always been bridging the gap between ancient knowledge and modern capabilities, Eleanor said, picking up a device that looked like a cross between a spectrometer and a Geiger counter. The monks' techniques worked, but they required lifelong training and cultural conditions that don't exist in the modern world. We needed methods that could be implemented by people with day jobs and families. Hence the Grove. Annual gatherings of influential people, focused ritual activities, enough genuine belief and emotional investment to create the necessary resonance. She set down the device and looked at me seriously. But it's a band-aid solution, and we all know it. The original binding required full-time practitioners working in optimal conditions. We're trying to maintain something incredibly complex and dangerous using part-time amateurs. We reached the centre of the archive, where a circular area had been cleared for what appeared to be a viewing room. Multiple monitors displayed real-time data streams, seismic readings, atmospheric measurements, and more esoteric graphs tracking things labelled psychic resonance and entity containment levels. This is where we monitor the binding stability, Eleanor explained, settling into one of the chairs facing the displays. 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The moment something starts to deteriorate, we know about it. I studied the screens, trying to make sense of the constantly shifting data. One monitor showed a map of the world with coloured dots marking locations where anomalous events had occurred in the past 24 hours. Another displayed what looked like seismic data, but with patterns that seemed too regular to be natural earthquakes. What's the current status? Eleanor's expression grew grave. Declining. The binding has been weakening steadily for the past 15 years, accelerating in the past 5. We estimate maybe 2 to 3 years before complete failure becomes inevitable. What happens then? Unknown. The historical records from previous binding failures are incomplete. The monks who witnessed them were usually dead within months. But we can make educated guesses based on pattern analysis. She pulled up another screen, this one showing a timeline of major global events overlaid with containment stability measurements. The correlation was undeniable. Every period of significant chaos in human history corresponded with dramatic drops in whatever they were measuring. Complete binding failure would likely trigger cascading system collapses, Eleanor continued. Political institutions, economic markets, social structures, all the complex relationships that hold civilization together become vulnerable when certain types of influence are unchecked. How bad are we talking? Best case scenario? A severe global recession coupled with widespread political instability, multiple government collapses, market crashes, social unrest spreading faster than any rational analysis would predict. And worst case? Eleanor was quiet for a long moment, studying the data streams that painted an increasingly grim picture of whatever they were monitoring. Worst case is the end of human civilization as we know it, not through nuclear war or climate change or any of the threats people talk about in public, through something much more fundamental, the breakdown of the psychological and spiritual structures that allow complex societies to exist. She pulled up historical records from previous binding failures, translated accounts from Tibetan monasteries that had witnessed similar events centuries earlier. The entity doesn't destroy through physical force, she explained. It works through consciousness, through the collective human capacity for cooperation and rational thought. When the binding fails completely, people lose the ability to trust institutions, to believe in shared values, to work together toward common goals. Everything falls apart from within. I stared at the monitors, watching real-time measurements of something that supposedly determined the fate of human civilization. The graphs showed steady decline across multiple indicators, punctuated by sudden spikes that corresponded to major news events I recognized from recent headlines. This is why you needed an outside journalist, I realized. The inner circle is dying off, and you need someone to document the whole system before it's too late. Partly. But there's another reason. Eleanor turned to face me directly. We think the traditional approach might be fundamentally flawed. What do you mean? The Grove, the annual ceremonies, the networking among powerful elites. It all assumes that influence and authority are the same thing they were 50 years ago. But the world has changed. Real power increasingly lies with people who have no connection to traditional institutions. She pulled up another screen, this one showing social media analytics and internet traffic patterns. Modern influence is distributed, digital, and often anonymous. A teenager with a viral video can shape public opinion more effectively than a senator. Cryptocurrency traders can destabilize national currencies. Hackers can cripple infrastructure. The Grove model assumes that controlling government and corporate leaders gives you control over social stability. But it doesn't anymore. Exactly. Which means our containment strategy might be obsolete just when we need it most. Eleanor stood up, pacing between the monitors. We need new approaches, new methods, new people involved in the binding process. But we also need someone on the outside who can document everything we've learned, preserve the institutional knowledge in case our transition efforts fail. You want me to write the ultimate conspiracy theory article. I want you to write the truth. All of it. The complete history of Project Owl, the scientific evidence for non-physical phenomena affecting global stability, the methods we've developed for managing existential threats that most people don't believe exist. She led me to another section of the archive, this one containing dozens of film reels stored in climate-controlled cases. But first, you need to understand exactly what we're dealing with. The Nazi expedition that started all this documented their activities extensively. They filmed everything, convinced they were making history. Eleanor selected one of the reels and loaded it into a vintage projector that looked like it belonged in a museum. The screen flickered to life, showing black and white footage of men in SS uniforms working in what appeared to be a Tibetan monastery. Tibet, 1943, Eleanor narrated as the images played. The Ahnenerbe expedition, led by Heinrich Himmler's personal occult research division. They found what they were looking for, but they had no idea what they were actually dealing with. The film showed German archaeologists carefully removing artifacts from hidden chambers, documenting everything with scientific precision. But as they worked, the footage began to show anomalies, shadows that moved independently of their sources, equipment malfunctioning in ways that defied explanation. And in the faces of the expedition members, a growing sense of unease that became terror as the film progressed. "Watch what happens when they break the original seal," Eleanor said. On screen, the Germans used explosives to breach a stone chamber that had clearly been sealed for centuries. The moment the barrier cracked, the camera recorded something that made my skin crawl, a sound like wind rushing through tunnels, but with an intelligence behind it that felt actively malevolent. The expedition members began arguing, then fighting, then turning on each other with a violence that seemed to come from nowhere. Within hours of breaking the seal, half the team was dead, and the survivors were fleeing through the mountains carrying only the most portable artifacts. "They thought they'd found weapons," Eleanor explained as the reel ended. What they actually found was something that used them as weapons against each other. The surviving members of the expedition spent the rest of the war trying to develop countermeasures, but it was too late. The damage was already spreading. She loaded another reel, this one showing American soldiers in 1945 investigating what remained of German occult research facilities. General Patton's intelligence units found the Nazi research archives during the final push into Germany. Most of it was dismissed as mystical nonsense, but a few people recognized the potential strategic implications. The second film showed American scientists examining the artifacts that would eventually end up at Bohemian Grove, testing them with instruments that clearly couldn't measure what they were really dealing with. But the effects were undeniable. Personnel exposed to the artifacts began exhibiting erratic behavior, making increasingly irrational decisions, turning against colleagues and superiors without apparent cause. Project Owl was established to contain and study the artifacts while developing countermeasures, Eleanor continued. The Grove became the testing ground for large-scale containment techniques. And it worked. For almost 80 years, yes, but the binding requires constant maintenance, and each generation faces new challenges. She showed me more reels, documenting decades of research and development, scientists working to understand forces that couldn't be quantified, politicians unknowingly participating in rituals designed to maintain global stability, business leaders whose networking activities served purposes they never suspected. The most recent footage showed the Grove ceremonies I'd witnessed, but from multiple camera angles that revealed details invisible to casual observers. During the official cremation of care, sophisticated monitoring equipment tracked energy fluctuations that spiked dramatically during specific moments of the ritual. The hidden ceremony showed even more dramatic readings, with measurements that peaked exactly when the chanting reached its climax. The science isn't complete, Eleanor admitted. We're still working with phenomena that exist at the intersection of consciousness and physics, in areas where traditional materialist approaches break down. But the effects are measurable, reproducible, and absolutely critical for global stability. Why hasn't any of this been published? Because publication would destroy the effectiveness of the countermeasures. The binding works partly because the participants believe in what they're doing, even if they don't understand the underlying mechanisms. Widespread skepticism and debunking would undermine the psychological foundations that make the ritual effective. She gestured toward the monitors showing real-time containment data. But we're reaching a point where secrecy might be more dangerous than exposure. The traditional power structures that maintain the Grove system are fragmenting. New forms of influence are emerging faster than we can adapt, and the entity itself seems to be evolving, finding new ways to exploit modern communication systems and social networks. What are you asking me to do? Eleanor stopped the projector and faced me directly. Document everything. Learn how the system works, understand what's at stake, and prepare a complete record that can preserve this knowledge for future generations. Then help us figure out how to adapt these techniques for a world where power and influence operate according to completely different rules. And if I refuse? Then you'll have an interesting story about rich men performing rituals in the woods. You'll publish it, people will read it as entertainment, and the most important secret in human history will die with us. The monitors around us continued their steady tracking of forces I was only beginning to understand. Whatever they were measuring was declining steadily, and the implications of that decline were more terrifying than any conventional threat I could imagine. How long do I have to decide? The next phase of your education starts tonight, Eleanor said. We'll show you the complete film archive, introduce you to the current research team, and give you access to the real-time monitoring systems. After that, you'll understand exactly what's at stake. She began shutting down the projection equipment, preparing to leave the archive. But I should warn you, once you've seen everything, there's no going back. The knowledge becomes a responsibility, and that responsibility will follow you for the rest of your life. As we climbed back toward the surface, I tried to process what I'd learned. Either I'd stumbled into the most elaborate hoax in human history, or I was being invited to document something that made every conspiracy theory seem quaint by comparison. The shed above us looked innocent enough in the afternoon sunlight, just another maintenance building in a forest full of them. But beneath our feet lay evidence of forces that supposedly shaped the course of human civilization, monitored by people who carried the weight of secrets too dangerous for public consumption. Tomorrow night, I'd see the rest of the archive. Tomorrow night, I'd learn whether Project Owl represented humanity's greatest triumph or its most necessary deception. Either way, my life as I knew it was ending. The only question was what would replace it. Eleanor met me again at sunset, appearing beside my cabin as the dinner bell rang across the grove. Around us, members were gathering for the evening's entertainment, some kind of historical presentation about Grove traditions that would give us perfect cover for our real activities. Tonight you see everything, she said simply. The complete archive going back to the beginning. Fair warning, some of it isn't easy to watch. We took a different route to the underground facility, following maintenance paths that avoided the main camp areas. Eleanor moved with the confidence of someone who'd made this journey countless times, but I noticed she kept checking her watch with increasing frequency. Are we on a schedule? The containment readings have been fluctuating all day, she explained. Nothing critical yet, but we want to complete your education before the situation becomes complicated. The archive felt different at night. Emergency lighting cast harsh shadows between the shelving units, and the climate control system seemed louder in the darkness above. Eleanor led me to a section I hadn't seen before, where dozens of film canisters were stored in temperature-controlled cases. Chronological order, she said, pulling out the first reel. Tibet, 1943. This is where it all started. The footage was better preserved than I'd expected, considering its age. German expedition members documented their activities with scientific precision, filming everything from arrival at the monastery to the careful cataloguing of artefacts they found in hidden chambers. But what struck me most was the change in the expedition members themselves as the film progressed. They started as confident researchers, convinced they were recovering important historical artefacts for the Reich. By the end, they were hollow-eyed and paranoid, jumping at shadows and arguing with increasing violence over trivial decisions. Watch the progression, Eleanor advised as she loaded the second reel. The deterioration follows a predictable pattern. She was right. The expedition leader, who appeared calm and competent in early footage, gradually became erratic and suspicious. He began seeing conspiracies among his own team members, making accusations that had no basis in reality. Other team members developed obsessive behaviours, repetitive actions that served no logical purpose, but which they couldn't seem to stop. The entity doesn't possess people in any dramatic sense, Eleanor explained. It influences them, amplifies existing psychological weaknesses, makes rational cooperation increasingly difficult. The later reels showed the aftermath. German scientists attempting to study the recovered artefacts, unaware that exposure to them was affecting their judgment and behaviour. Research that started as methodical investigation devolved into fractured efforts as team members became unable to work together effectively. By 1944, the Nazi research program was in complete disarray, Eleanor said, loading footage from American intelligence units. Not because they lacked resources or expertise, but because the people involved had lost the capacity for organised, rational effort. The American footage was even more disturbing. Soldiers who'd participated in securing the German research facilities began exhibiting similar symptoms within weeks: paranoia, aggression, an inability to follow orders or work as a team. The artifacts were quickly transferred to secure facilities, but the damage was already spreading through the military units involved. This is when President Roosevelt authorized Project Owl, Eleanor said, showing me classified documents I definitely shouldn't have been seeing. The decision was made to contain the artifacts rather than study them, at least until we understood what we were dealing with. The next series of reels documented the early years of the Grove's involvement. Prominent businessmen and politicians who thought they were participating in elaborate team-building exercises, unaware that their activities were being carefully monitored for their effects on containment stability. The beautiful irony, Eleanor noted, is that the most effective participants were people who took the rituals seriously, without believing in their literal truth. They invested genuine emotional energy in symbolic activities, creating the psychological resonance necessary for containment without the skepticism that would undermine it. I watched decades of Grove ceremonies, seeing the evolution from crude early attempts to the sophisticated rituals I'd witnessed. The filmmakers documented everything from multiple angles, tracking correlations between participant behaviour and mysterious readings on monitoring equipment. The breakthrough came in 1963, Eleanor said, loading a reel marked Project Mindbridge Consciousness Research Initiative. We finally began to understand the relationship between collective human consciousness and what we were trying to contain. This footage showed scientists working with equipment that looked decades ahead of anything I'd seen in public research facilities. They were mapping what they called psychic resonance fields, measuring the effects of focused group attention on phenomena that traditional science insisted didn't exist. Consciousness isn't passive, Eleanor explained as the footage showed researchers monitoring brainwave patterns during Grove ceremonies. Under specific conditions, focused human attention can influence physical processes through mechanisms we still don't fully understand. The evidence was compelling. During successful binding rituals, monitoring equipment showed dramatic changes in local electromagnetic fields, gravitational anomalies, and other effects that defied conventional explanation. The more focused and emotionally invested the participants, the stronger the measured effects. But the most important discovery was that the entity itself is conscious, Eleanor continued, loading a reel from the 1970s. Not conscious like a human or animal, but aware in ways that allow it to adapt and respond to our containment efforts. This footage was harder to watch. It showed experiments where researchers deliberately weakened containment protocols to study the entity's responses. The results were horrifying. Within hours, people exposed to the weakened binding began turning on each other with a savagery that had no rational explanation. We learned that it doesn't just influence behaviour randomly, Eleanor said. It targets the specific psychological and social bonds that hold groups together. It makes people distrust authority, question shared values, abandon cooperation in favour of individual survival. The final series of reels brought the documentation up to the present day. Recent Grove ceremonies filmed with modern digital equipment, showing measurements that painted an increasingly dire picture. The binding was weakening despite their best efforts, and the entity's influence was spreading through channels they were still struggling to understand. Internet culture, social media, digital communication, they've created new vectors for the kind of psychological influence the entity specialises in, Eleanor explained. People are more isolated, more suspicious, more prone to conspiracy thinking than ever before. The very technologies that connect us globally are making us more vulnerable to forces that exploit human psychological weaknesses. She showed me correlation analyses that were truly frightening. Every major spike in online harassment, political extremism, and social division corresponded with measured fluctuations in containment stability. The entity wasn't just confined to the physical artifacts anymore. It was spreading through digital networks, using human communication systems to amplify its influence. This is why traditional approaches aren't working, Eleanor said. The Grove model assumes that controlling physical locations and influential people gives you control over social stability. But in a networked world, influence operates according to completely different rules. The most recent footage showed research teams working on new approaches. attempts to create digital containment protocols, online rituals that could engage globally distributed participants, technological methods for monitoring and countering the entity's influence through internet channels. The preliminary results are promising, Eleanor admitted, but we're running out of time. The traditional binding is failing faster than we can develop alternatives. She turned off the projection equipment and faced me directly. That's the complete record. 80 years of research containment and gradual understanding of something that exists at the intersection of consciousness and physics. Now, you understand what we're really dealing with. I sat in silence for several minutes, trying to process what I'd seen. The footage was too detailed, too consistent, too well documented to be an elaborate hoax. But accepting it as real meant accepting that everything I thought I knew about how the world worked was fundamentally incomplete. What do you need from me? Help us bridge the gap between old knowledge and new realities, Eleanor said. Document everything we've learned, but also help us figure out how to adapt these techniques for a world where influence operates through social media and digital networks rather than exclusive clubs and private meetings. I'm a journalist, not a researcher. You're someone who understands how information spreads in the modern world, how narratives form and evolve, how public opinion gets shaped by forces most people never notice. Those are exactly the skills we need. She gestured toward the monitors showing real-time containment data. The entity is learning to use our own communication systems against us. We need people who understand those systems well enough to develop countermeasures. And if we fail, Eleanor's expression grew grave, then within the next few years human civilization enters a period of chaos and collapse unlike anything in recorded history, not through war or natural disaster, but through the breakdown of the psychological foundations that make complex societies possible. The weight of what she was telling me settled on my shoulders like a physical burden. If they were right, I wasn't just being offered the story of a lifetime, I was being recruited to help prevent the end of the world as we knew it. When do we start? Tomorrow, Eleanor said. But first, you need to see what happens when containment fails. We have one more reel to show you. Footage from 1962, when a test of weakened binding protocols got out of hand. She loaded the final reel, and I watched something that would haunt my dreams for years to come. Research subjects exposed to deliberately weakened containment turned on each other with a ferocity that looked less like human behaviour than like animals driven mad by disease. Within hours, rational people became incapable of basic cooperation, seeing enemies everywhere, responding to imagined threats with real violence. Multiply that by global population, Eleanor said quietly, and you begin to understand what we're trying to prevent. As we climbed back toward the surface, I realised there was no going back. Whether Project Owl represented the most important secret in human history, or the most elaborate delusion ever created, I was now part of it. The knowledge had become a responsibility, and that responsibility would shape everything I did for the rest of my life. Above us, the Grove continued its normal activities. Powerful people, networking and bonding, unaware that their casual retreats served a purpose that might determine the survival of human civilization. Tomorrow I'd begin learning how to help them succeed. I woke before dawn to the sound of helicopters, not the distant drone of aircraft passing over, but the heavy thrum of rotors directly overhead, circling the Grove in patterns that suggested search rather than transport. Eleanor appeared at my cabin door before I'd finished dressing, her usual composed demeanour replaced by urgent tension. "We have a problem," she said simply. "Someone's been monitoring our activities." She led me quickly through the forest, avoiding the main paths and staying under tree cover that would hide us from aerial observation. The helicopters were government aircraft, she explained, but not ones under Project Owl's control. Different agencies have different levels of clearance, she said as we moved. Some know about our activities, some know only pieces, and some know nothing but suspect something significant is happening here. Which category do the helicopters represent? The dangerous one. People who know enough to be suspicious but not enough to understand the consequences of interference. We reached the concealed entrance to the archive facility, but Eleanor didn't lead me inside. Instead, she continued deeper into the forest, towards sections of the Grove I'd never seen. "The underground facility is compromised," she explained. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, electromagnetic monitoring. Anyone with the right equipment can detect activity below ground. We need to show you the backup systems. After 20 minutes of hiking through increasingly dense forest, we reached what appeared to be a natural clearing dominated by a single massive redwood. Eleanor approached the tree and pressed her hand against a section of bark that looked identical to every other section. A hidden panel slid aside, revealing modern electronic equipment built directly into the living wood. "Emergency monitoring station," she said, activating screens that showed the same real-time data I'd seen in the underground archive. "If the main facility's compromised, we can still track containment stability from here." The readings were worse than anything I'd seen before. Multiple indicators showed rapid deterioration, with fluctuations that spiked dramatically every time the helicopters passed overhead. "Electromagnetic interference," Eleanor explained. "The aircraft are disrupting the resonance fields that maintain the binding. They don't know what they're doing, but the effect is cumulative." As if summoned by her words, one of the helicopters passed directly overhead, and the monitoring equipment registered a spike that made Eleanor curse under her breath. "We need to evacuate the sensitive materials," she said, beginning to shut down the equipment. "The original artifacts, the most critical research data, anything that can't be replaced." "Where?" "Secondary sites." We learned decades ago never to keep everything in one location. She finished securing the monitoring station and led me back toward the main camp. "But first, we need to get you away from here. If this goes wrong, you're the only person outside the project who knows the complete truth." We were halfway back to my cabin when the shooting started. Not gunfire, something else. The sharp crack of what sounded like electrical discharges. Through the trees, I could see flashes of light that had nothing to do with the helicopters overhead. "What is that?" Eleanor grabbed my arm, pulling me behind the massive trunk of an ancient redwood. "Containment failure. The electromagnetic interference pushed the binding past critical thresholds." The flashes were coming from the direction of the sacred grove, where the official ceremonies took place. But these weren't artificial lights. They looked like lightning, but moving in patterns that defied any natural explanation. "The entity is breaking through," Eleanor said, checking her watch with obvious anxiety. "Localized manifestation, probably limited to the immediate area, but we need to implement emergency protocols immediately." "What kind of emergency protocols?" Before she could answer, a man appeared through the trees, one of the Grove members I'd seen at the dining hall, but changed in ways that made my skin crawl. His face was twisted with rage that seemed to come from nowhere, and he was carrying what appeared to be a broken tree branch like a weapon. "You?" he said, focusing on Eleanor with hatred that was obviously irrational. You're the one who's been lying to us." Eleanor stepped back, keeping the tree trunk between herself and the approaching man. "George, you need to get back to your cabin. You're not thinking clearly." "Thinking perfectly clearly for the first time in years," George replied, raising the makeshift weapon. "Seeing through all the lies, all the manipulation. You people think you can control us, think you can use us for your games." He swung the branch at Eleanor's head with murderous intent. She dodged, but barely, and I realised with growing horror that we were seeing the entity's influence in real time. George wasn't just angry. He was completely detached from normal human empathy and reason. "This is what happens when containment fails," Eleanor said quietly, pulling me deeper into the forest. "People lose the capacity for rational cooperation. They see enemies everywhere, respond to imagined threats with real violence." Behind us, George was joined by others, Grove members who transformed from networking politicians and businessmen into something that barely resembled human beings. They moved with pack mentality, communicating through gestures and sounds that suggested intelligence but not consciousness as I understood it. "How do we stop it?" "Emergency binding ritual," Eleanor said, leading me toward another concealed facility. "But it requires specific people in specific locations, and we're running out of time." The facility she brought me to was smaller than the main archive, but clearly designed for crisis situations. Emergency supplies, backup communication equipment, and most importantly, a collection of artifacts identical to the ones I'd seen in the underground chamber. "Portable containment kit," Eleanor explained, gathering materials with practiced efficiency. The ritual can be performed anywhere, but it's less stable than the permanent installation. She handed me a metal disc covered with the same spiralling symbols I'd seen before, but this one felt warm to the touch and seemed to vibrate with energy I couldn't identify. Hold this and think calming thoughts, she instructed. Visualize peace, cooperation, people working together toward common goals. The binding responds to consciousness, but it requires focused intention from multiple participants. I don't know how to do this. You don't need training, you need belief. The entity feeds on conflict and suspicion. The binding requires the opposite. Trust, cooperation, shared purpose. As she spoke, the sounds from outside grew worse. More Grove members had joined the pack hunting us, but their behaviour was becoming less and less human. They were making sounds that reminded me of wolves or wild dogs, communicating through methods that bypassed language entirely. They're not possessed, Eleanor explained, setting up equipment that looked like a cross between a radio and a meditation altar. They're influenced. The entity amplifies existing psychological weaknesses, selfishness, paranoia, aggression, until rational cooperation becomes impossible. How long does it last? Without intervention? Permanent. The changes become self-reinforcing, creating a cycle of escalating conflict that spreads to anyone exposed to the affected individuals. She activated the emergency equipment, and I felt the disc in my hands grow warmer. Around us, the air seemed to thicken, taking on the quality of electrical charge that precedes thunderstorms. Now, Eleanor said, focus on everything that makes human civilization possible. Trust between strangers, cooperation across differences, the willingness to sacrifice individual advantage for collective benefit. I tried to do what she asked, but the sounds outside made concentration nearly impossible. The hunting pack had found our location and was circling the facility, testing for weak points with animal cunning. It's not working, I said. It needs more participants, Eleanor admitted. The emergency protocol requires at least 7 people working in coordination. I was hoping we could manage with 2, but the interference is too strong. As if responding to her words, the attackers began trying to break down the door, but their methods were wrong somehow. They were using tactics that might work against prey animals, but not against humans who understood tools and leverage. Their intelligence is being affected, Eleanor observed. They're losing abstract reasoning, reverting to more primitive cognitive patterns. Is that good or bad for us? Both. They can't plan sophisticated attacks, but they also can't be reasoned with or distracted. The door was beginning to buckle under coordinated assault. Within minutes they'd break through, and I had no illusions about what would happen then. The people outside might once have been politicians and businessmen, but they'd become something that saw us as threats to be eliminated. Eleanor made a decision that probably saved our lives. Run, she said, gathering the most essential artifacts into a backpack. There's a service road 2 miles north of here. Follow it east until you reach Highway 101, then go south to San Francisco. What about you? I'll try to implement the emergency protocol with whatever Grove members are still unaffected. But you need to get this information to the outside world. She handed me a small device that looked like an ordinary cell phone but felt heavier than it should. Encrypted satellite communicator, she explained. Speed dial 1 connects you to our backup facility in Colorado. Tell them what happened here and give them your location. They'll arrange extraction and debriefing. The door gave way just as we climbed out through a concealed rear exit. I heard Eleanor shouting something that sounded like Latin, saw flashes of light that suggested she was attempting some kind of emergency ritual, but I was already running through the forest as fast as the terrain would allow. Behind me the sounds of conflict grew worse, not just the pack that had been hunting us, but what sounded like warfare spreading throughout the grove. The entity's influence was expanding, affecting more and more people, creating a feedback loop of violence that would keep escalating until someone found a way to stop it. I ran for over an hour, following game trails and maintenance paths that led generally north. Twice I heard helicopters overhead, but I couldn't tell if they were still part of the problem or part of some attempted solution. The encrypted communicator remained silent. Either the backup facility was out of range, or something had happened to it as well. The service road, when I finally found it, was blocked by abandoned vehicles. Grove security guards had apparently fled their posts, leaving gates open and equipment scattered. Whatever had happened here was bigger than just the immediate area around the sacred grove. I followed the road east on foot, staying off the asphalt to avoid being visible from the air. The communicator finally picked up a signal as I reached higher ground, but when I activated speed dial 1, the response wasn't what I had expected. "Project Owl emergency line," a voice said. "State your clearance level and location." "I don't have a clearance level," I said. "Eleanor Hartwell gave me this device. There's been a containment failure at Bohemian Grove." A pause, then. "Are you the journalist?" "Yes." "We've been expecting your call. What's your current location?" I described my position as best I could, and the voice gave me coordinates for a pickup point 5 miles south of my position. "Emergency extraction team is en route," the voice said. "ETA 40 minutes. Stay hidden until you see a black helicopter with owl markings." "What happened to Eleanor?" Another pause, longer this time. "Unknown. We lost contact with all Grove personnel 3 hours ago. You may be the only survivor with first-hand knowledge of the incident." The call ended, leaving me alone on a forest road with the weight of impossible knowledge. If Eleanor was right, I'd just witnessed the beginning of something that could destroy human civilization. If she was wrong, I'd been recruited into the most elaborate delusion in history. Either way, there was no going back. The story I'd come to investigate had become my life, and that life would never be the same. The helicopter that picked me up wasn't military, but it wasn't civilian either. Black, unmarked, with sound dampening that made it whisper rather than roar. The pilot didn't speak during the 40-minute flight south, and the windows were tinted too dark to see our destination until we landed. The facility looked like a corporate retreat centre, modern architecture nestled in rolling hills, solar panels and native landscaping that suggested environmental consciousness rather than government secrecy. Only the subtle security measures revealed its true nature. Sensors disguised as decorative elements, barriers that looked like artistic features, multiple escape routes hidden as walking paths. Eleanor was waiting for me in the lobby. She looked exhausted but uninjured, wearing clean clothes that suggested she'd arrived well before me. Relief flooded through me at seeing her alive, followed immediately by suspicion about how she'd gotten here so quickly. "You made it," she said, embracing me with what felt like genuine emotion. "I wasn't sure you would." "How are you here?" "I thought you were trapped at the Grove." "Emergency protocols," she explained, leading me toward a conference room. "The moment containment failed, automated systems began evacuating key personnel and sensitive materials. I was out within minutes of your escape." The conference room contained a dozen people I'd never seen before, all of them studying multiple screens showing data feeds from Bohemian Grove. The footage was disturbing. Grove members moving in coordinated packs, exhibiting behaviour that looked less human with each passing hour. "Situation report," said a woman who appeared to be in charge, younger than Eleanor, with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-and-death decisions under pressure. "Complete local containment failure," Eleanor replied. "The electromagnetic interference from unauthorized surveillance pushed binding stability past critical thresholds. The entity achieved localized manifestation and began directly influencing exposed personnel. Casualties? Unknown. Approximately 200 Grove members were on site when the failure occurred. Current status of affected individuals is unclear, but behavioral modification appears to be progressing according to predicted patterns. I watched the screens showing real-time footage from the Grove, trying to process what I was seeing. The people in the images moved with animal coordination, but their actions showed planning and intelligence that suggested they weren't completely reduced to primitive instincts. "They're organising," I observed. "Exactly," said the woman in charge. "The entity doesn't just cause chaos, it creates new forms of order based on conflict and dominance rather than cooperation and trust. Left unchecked, the affected population will form a functional society, but one dedicated to spreading their condition to others." "How?" Eleanor pulled up additional screens showing modelling predictions. "Physical contact isn't required. Extended exposure to affected individuals gradually influences behaviour in others. The process is slower than direct manifestation, but it's cumulative and irreversible without intervention." "What kind of intervention?" "That's what we need to decide," the woman in charge said. "We have 3 options, none of them good." She activated a presentation that laid out scenarios with clinical precision. Option 1, military containment. Seal off the affected area, prevent anyone from leaving, wait for the situation to stabilise. The affected population would eventually die off, but we'd lose any chance of understanding how the entity adapted to modern conditions. Option 2, aggressive binding ritual. Deploy our full capabilities to re-establish containment, potentially reversing the effects on affected individuals. High probability of success, but it would require resources that might be needed for future emergencies. Option 3, strategic documentation. Allow the situation to develop while recording everything, learning how the entity operates in uncontrolled conditions. Massive risk of spread, but invaluable data for developing long-term countermeasures. The weight of what they were asking settled on me like a physical presence. These weren't abstract policy decisions. They were choices about the lives of people I'd shared meals with, conversations with, casual moments of human connection that now seemed impossibly precious. "What do you recommend?" I asked. "That depends on you," Eleanor said. "You're the only person who witnessed the complete sequence of events, the only outsider who understands what's really at stake. Your perspective could determine which approach we take." I studied the screens showing real-time surveillance of the Grove. The affected members were building something, crude structures that served purposes I couldn't identify, but which suggested they retained enough intelligence to plan and execute complex projects. They're not just reverting to primitive behaviour, I realised. They're creating something new. "Exactly," Eleanor confirmed. "The entity doesn't destroy civilization. It transforms it into something that serves its purposes rather than human ones. And if this spreads beyond the Grove..." "Modelling suggests a tipping point around 10,000 affected individuals," the woman in charge said. "Beyond that, containment becomes impossible. The entity achieves critical mass and begins reshaping human civilization according to its own principles." I stared at the screens, watching people who'd once controlled vast resources and wielded enormous influence reduced to something that resembled humanity, but fundamentally wasn't. The choice they were asking me to make would determine not just the fate of those individuals, but potentially the future of human civilization itself. "How long do we have to decide?" "Hours," Eleanor said grimly. "The affected population is already attempting to breach the Grove's perimeter. Once they reach populated areas, the window for containment closes permanently." As if summoned by her words, alarms began sounding throughout the facility. On the screens, we watched Grove members systematically dismantling the barriers that had kept them isolated from the outside world. They moved with coordinated purpose, using tools and techniques that suggested retained intelligence despite their transformed state. "They're adapting faster than our models predicted," the woman in charge observed. "The entity is learning from direct interaction with modern infrastructure." I made my decision. "Option 2, I said. "Full binding ritual. Try to save them." Eleanor nodded grimly. "It'll require everything we have. If we fail, there won't be resources left for future containment efforts. And if we do nothing, there won't be a future to contain." The next 6 hours passed in a blur of coordinated activity. Teams deployed to locations around the Grove, carrying artifacts and equipment I was only beginning to understand. The binding ritual required precise positioning, perfect timing, and absolute faith in principles that defied everything I'd learned about how the world worked. But it worked. I watched on screens as the coordinated behaviour of the affected Grove members gradually became confused, then chaotic, then slowly returned to something recognisably human. The transformation took hours, but by dawn rescue teams were extracting survivors who remembered nothing of their transformed state but everything of their normal lives. The official story, when it emerged, blamed a gas leak for temporary behavioural effects among Grove attendees. A few conspiracy theorists suggested government mind control experiments, but without hard evidence, their theories joined the usual background noise of speculation about elite gatherings. 6 months later, I sit in my apartment staring at a hard drive containing the complete documentation of Project Owl. Video footage, research data, historical records, and testimony from dozens of participants spanning 8 decades of secret work to maintain global stability. The binding held. The Grove members recovered completely, with no memory of their transformation, The immediate crisis passed, and the world continued its normal pattern of manageable chaos and incremental progress. But the monitoring data tells a different story. The entity learned from its brief manifestation. Each subsequent containment requires more resources, more participants, more sophisticated countermeasures. The traditional approaches that worked for decades are becoming less effective with each passing year. Eleanor calls weekly with updates from facilities I'm not supposed to know exist. Teams working on digital containment protocols, researchers developing new methods for managing consciousness-based phenomena, analysts tracking the entity's adaptation to modern communication networks. They're making progress, but the race is getting closer. My phone buzzes with news alerts. Political assassinations in 3 countries, simultaneous market crashes that defy economic analysis, social unrest spreading through digital networks faster than anyone can track. Each event correlates with fluctuations in containment stability, signs that the old binding is weakening despite our best efforts. I have a choice to make. The hard drive contains everything needed to preserve Project Owl's institutional knowledge. Published as fiction, it would ensure the information survives, even if the current organisation fails. Presented as investigative journalism, it might mobilise resources for developing new containment methods. But publication might also undermine the psychological foundations that make the binding effective. Widespread skepticism could destroy the very mechanisms that have protected human civilization for 80 years. My cursor hovers over the upload button for a secure server that would distribute the complete files to journalists worldwide. With one click, I could expose the most important secret in human history. Or I could delete everything and trust that the people carrying this burden know what they're doing. Outside my window, the city continues its normal rhythm of traffic and commerce. Millions of people living their lives unaware that the stability they take for granted depends on secrets too dangerous for public consumption. They don't know that their capacity for trust, cooperation and rational discourse is maintained by forces that most would dismiss as impossible. Maybe that's how it should be. Maybe some truths are too important to share. I close the laptop without making a decision, knowing I'll face the same choice tomorrow and the day after, and every day until either the binding holds permanently or everything falls apart. The hard drive sits on my desk like a loaded weapon, containing information that could save the world or destroy it, depending on how it's used. In the forest north of San Francisco, ancient redwoods continue their patient growth, sheltering secrets that predate human civilization. Beneath their roots, monitoring equipment tracks forces that exist at the intersection of consciousness and physics, measuring phenomena that determine whether humanity remains capable of the cooperation and trust that make complex societies possible. The owl watches and waits, neither good nor evil, but something far more dangerous. A force of pure change that cares nothing for human hopes or fears. And somewhere in the darkness between sleeping and waking, it grows stronger. Maybe they weren't hiding power. Maybe they were hiding what power keeps at bay. But how long can any cage hold something that learns from every attempt to contain it? I guess we'll find out. What if I told you that 6 US Army intelligence analysts didn't desert their posts in 1990? They escaped. That the official story of religious delusion and UFO obsession was a cover for something far more sinister? That beneath the swamps of Gulf Breeze, Florida, lies a frequency grid capable of rewriting human perception itself. Tonight we delve into the classified files of the Gulf Breeze 6, where biblical prophecy meets military experimentation and reality itself becomes a weapon. Like and subscribe to Sleep Theories if you enjoy these stories, and a quick thanks to Jeffernon1772 for suggesting this story idea. Leave your video ideas in the comments below, and we might just create a future story from it. Chapter 1. The Desertion, July 1990. I never expected to spend my retirement years wondering if I helped cover up the most significant military defection of the Cold War. But here I am, 33 years later, still hearing those signals in my dreams. My name is Thomas Kellerman, and from 1988 to 1992 I served as a signals technician at Gablingen Station near Augsburg, Germany. Officially, we monitored Warsaw Pact communications. Unofficially, we were an NSA listening post. part of the vast electronic surveillance network that stretched across Europe like a spider's web of antennas and encrypted data streams. July 14th, 1990 started like any other shift. The morning briefing covered the usual suspects: Soviet submarine movements in the Baltic, encrypted transmissions from East German border stations, and the ongoing political upheaval as the Berlin Wall's fall continued to reverberate across Eastern Europe. What they didn't mention was that 6 of our intelligence analysts had failed to report for duty: Vance Davis, Annette Eccleston, Randy Quam, Bill Batten, Ken Smith, and Jeff Blake. Names that would later become whispered legends in certain intelligence circles, but at the time they were just colleagues who had inexplicably vanished in the night, leaving behind their security clearances, their classified materials, and their entire lives. The official line came down within hours: temporary absence without leave, likely due to stress. The Cold War was ending after all. People were having trouble adjusting to the New World Order. But I knew something else was happening, because I had been monitoring the communications logs for weeks leading up to their disappearance. Starting in mid-June, our satellite intercepts had begun picking up encrypted bursts at strange intervals. Not the usual Soviet chatter, this was something different. The signals came in clusters of 6, always 6, transmitted on frequencies that corresponded to no known military or civilian bands. Too regular to be atmospheric interference, too irregular to match any training exercise schedule we had on file. What made these transmissions truly unusual was their timing. They always occurred during geomagnetic storms, those invisible tempests in Earth's magnetic field that could disrupt communication satellites and cause aurora displays as far south as Germany. It was as if someone was using the planet's own electromagnetic instability as a carrier wave. I had flagged these anomalies in my reports, but they seemed to disappear into the bureaucratic void. No follow-up questions, no requests for additional monitoring, no acknowledgement that anything unusual was happening at all. In the intelligence community, that kind of silence usually meant one of 2 things. Either the signals were completely irrelevant, or they were so sensitive that even asking about them could end your career. The night before the 6 analysts vanished, I was pulling a double shift, covering for a colleague who had called in sick with what he claimed was food poisoning, but what I suspected was a serious case of German beer flu. Around 0300 hours, the intercept equipment began registering activity on those same mysterious frequencies. But this time was different. Instead of the usual encrypted bursts, I was hearing what sounded almost like voices. Faint, distorted, layered beneath static and interference, but unmistakably human speech. I fine-tuned the receivers, applied every filter and enhancement technique I knew, and slowly the words began to emerge from the electronic noise. Grid activation confirmed, subjects responding to calibration sequence, phase 1 complete. The transmission lasted exactly 6 minutes and 33 seconds. When it ended, the frequencies fell silent, and they would remain that way for the next month. By morning, 6 of our most experienced intelligence analysts had abandoned their posts and begun a journey that would take them halfway around the world to a small Florida town, famous for UFO sightings and military secrets. Official investigators would later claim that the group had suffered a collective psychological breakdown, that they believed they were receiving messages from God and extraterrestrial beings instructing them to prevent an impending apocalypse. The story made perfect sense if you didn't look too closely at the details. Religious delusion was easy to understand, easy to dismiss, and most importantly, easy to keep classified under the umbrella of national security and medical privacy. But I had heard that transmission. I had logged those frequencies, and I knew that whatever had reached out to the Gulf Breeze 6 wasn't coming from heaven or outer space. It was coming from much closer to home. Chapter 2: The Gulf Breeze Connection. 3 weeks after the desertion, I received an assignment that should have been routine: analyse communications intercepts from US installations in the Gulf Coast region. The official explanation was that we needed to verify the security of our own systems by monitoring them from external positions. Standard counterintelligence procedure. Nothing unusual about it. But when I saw the primary target location, my hands began to shake. Gulf Breeze, Florida. Even in 1990, Gulf Breeze was infamous in certain circles. Throughout the 1980s, the small coastal town had been the epicenter of one of the most documented UFO sighting waves in American history. Ed Walters, a local contractor, had photographed and videotaped dozens of alleged extraterrestrial craft, images that were simultaneously compelling and suspicious to anyone with experience in photo analysis. The town had become a magnet for UFO researchers, conspiracy theorists, and curious tourists. What most of them didn't know was that Gulf Breeze also sat at the convergence of several highly classified military installations. Eglin Air Force Base dominated the region with its sprawling test ranges and advanced weapons research facilities. The Naval Air Station Pensacola trained pilots and conducted flight experiments just across the bay, and scattered throughout the area were smaller facilities that officially didn't exist at all. My orders were to monitor civilian radio traffic in the Gulf Breeze area, ostensibly to identify any potential security breaches or unauthorized transmissions that might compromise nearby military operations. But as I began scanning the frequencies, I discovered something that made the hair on my neck stand up. Local residents had been reporting strange sounds on their shortwave radios during UFO sightings. Not the usual atmospheric static or distant AM radio stations bleeding through, but structured signals that seemed to pulse in patterns. When I compared these citizen reports with my logs from Augsburg, the timing was impossible to ignore. The mysterious transmissions I'd been intercepting in Germany weren't random. They were synchronized with the Gulf Breeze phenomenon, occurring during the same windows when residents reported both visual sightings and radio anomalies. Whatever was generating those signals was operating on both sides of the Atlantic simultaneously. I spent hours poring over the technical specifications, trying to understand how such a thing could be possible. Conventional radio transmissions couldn't maintain that kind of precise timing across such distances without some form of centralized control system. Satellite relays could theoretically do it, but the power requirements would be enormous, and the frequencies involved didn't match any known military or civilian satellite bands. The only explanation that made technical sense was that someone had developed a new form of electromagnetic communication system, one that used the Earth's own magnetic field as a transmission medium. Extremely low frequency signals could theoretically propagate through the planet itself, emerging at predetermined points around the globe with minimal time delay. But if such a system existed, it would represent a quantum leap in communications technology, decades ahead of anything publicly known. The military applications alone would be staggering. Untappable communications, global coordination of operations, the ability to send messages that couldn't be intercepted or jammed by conventional means. More disturbing was the possibility that such a system could be used not just for communication, but for influence. Extremely low-frequency electromagnetic fields had been shown to affect human brain activity, potentially altering mood, perception, and even inducing hallucinations or mystical experiences. If someone could generate precisely controlled ELF fields across wide geographic areas, they would possess a weapon more subtle and dangerous than nuclear arms. As I continued monitoring Gulf Breeze, a pattern began to emerge. The town wasn't just experiencing random UFO sightings. The incidents were following a schedule, occurring at regular intervals that corresponded to known fluctuations in the Earth's magnetic field. Geomagnetic storms, solar flare activity, even the lunar cycle seemed to influence when and where the phenomena appeared. It was beginning to look less like extraterrestrial visitation, and more like a carefully controlled experiment in applied psychophysics. The official reports on the Gulf Breeze 6 claimed they had been drawn to the area by religious visions and UFO obsession. But what if the truth was exactly the opposite? What if they hadn't been deluded by their experiences, but had somehow become aware of the real purpose behind the Gulf Breeze phenomenon? What if they hadn't deserted at all, but had tried to expose something that someone very powerful wanted to keep hidden? Chapter 3. The Missing Weeks. Tracking the movement of 6 AWOL military personnel across international borders should have been impossible without official cooperation, but in the intelligence community favours a currency, and I had accumulated enough goodwill over the years to call in a few debts. According to official records, Vance Davis and his 5 companions had simply driven around for the month, between their desertion in Germany and their arrest in Gulf Breeze. No specific route, no documented stops, just a vague journey across Europe and the Atlantic that somehow ended in the most UFO-active town in America. But credit card records tell a different story when you know how to read them. My contact at the Defence Finance and Accounting Service, a civilian contractor named Margaret who had been processing military pay vouchers since the Carter administration, had always been curious about unusual patterns in service member spending. When I asked her to run an informal audit on the Gulf Breeze 6, she discovered discrepancies that should have triggered a full investigation. The group's credit cards showed purchases at specific locations that didn't match the official timeline. Gas stations in Frankfurt, hotel bills in Amsterdam, meal charges in London, and then a curious gap of several days before transactions resumed in Miami. But the travel timing was impossible. Even accounting for the fastest commercial flights, they couldn't have covered those distances in the recorded timeframes. More suspicious were the locations of some purchases. 3 separate transactions occurred at or near facilities that, according to my security clearance database, were classified NASA communication stations. These weren't public visitor centres or launch viewing areas, but secured uplink facilities that handled satellite communications for various government agencies. One transaction in particular caught my attention. A fuel purchase at a service station less than 2 miles from Cape Canaveral Air Force Station, made at 3:47 a.m. on August 3, 1990. The timing coincided with a scheduled test of the Air Force Satellite Control Network, a classified system used to command and control military reconnaissance satellites. But the strangest part of the financial trail wasn't what was there, but what wasn't. Despite supposedly travelling for over a month with 6 people, the total expenditures were far too low. Even accounting for careful budgeting, the amount suggested they had either received outside funding or had spent significant time in locations where no purchases were necessary. While I was piecing together their financial movements, another piece of the puzzle emerged from an unexpected source. Chief Petty Officer Maria Rodriguez, stationed at Naval Air Station Pensacola, had been a friend since our joint assignment at a NATO communications facility in the mid-1980s. When I mentioned I was looking into unusual military movements in the Gulf Coast region, she hesitated, then told me something that had been bothering her for months. During late July and early August 1990, she had witnessed several nighttime convoys moving through the area around Pensacola. Military vehicles, but not following standard protocols. No advance notification to base security, no logged movements in the transportation databases, and most unusual of all, mixed service branches in the same convoy. Army trucks, Navy communications vans, and Air Force technical vehicles all travelling together, she explained. In 30 years of service, I've never seen anything like it. Different branches don't just spontaneously coordinate transport operations, especially not in the middle of the night. The convoys always moved east, toward the more remote areas of Eglin Air Force Base's vast test ranges. Maria had tried to follow one convoy out of curiosity, but had been turned back at a checkpoint that shouldn't have existed according to any base map she had access to. When I asked her to describe the timing of these convoy movements, she consulted her personal calendar and identified 7 separate incidents between July 28th and August 15th. I cross-referenced these dates with the Gulf Breeze 6 credit card transactions and found 3 direct correlations. The implications were staggering. The 6 missing analysts hadn't simply wandered aimlessly until ending up in Gulf Breeze by chance. They had been moving in coordination with military operations, possibly as part of those operations. Their month of supposed aimless travel might have been a month of active participation in whatever classified project was centred in the Gulf Coast region. But if they were working with official military units, why were they classified as deserters? Why arrest them at all? The only logical explanation was that something had gone wrong. Either they had learned something they weren't supposed to know, or they had decided to act against the interests of whoever was running the operation. The picture that was emerging suggested the Gulf Breeze 6 hadn't fled their posts in a moment of religious or psychological crisis. They had made a calculated decision to investigate something they had discovered through their intelligence work. something significant enough to risk their careers, their freedom, and possibly their lives. What they found in Gulf Breeze would soon be locked away in classified files, their testimonies buried under layers of national security restrictions and mental health evaluations. But the physical evidence of their journey, the credit card trails, the convoy sightings, the coordination with military movements, painted a picture of 6 intelligence professionals who had stumbled onto one of the most closely guarded secrets of the modern military-industrial complex. They hadn't been running away from their duties, they had been running toward the truth. Chapter 4. The Notebook. 3 months after the Gulf Breeze 6 were arrested, I found myself sitting in a classified briefing room at Gablingen Station, staring at photocopied pages that would haunt me for the next 3 decades. The briefing was ostensibly about communication security protocols, a routine update on protecting classified information from hostile intelligence services. But Colonel Harrison, our commanding officer, had included an unusual case study: the confiscated materials found in the possession of the 6 missing analysts. These documents represent a clear example of how psychological instability can compromise operational security, Harrison explained, clicking through a series of overhead slides. The subjects had filled multiple notebooks with what they claimed were divine revelations and extraterrestrial communications. The first few slides showed pages covered with biblical quotations, astronomical calculations, and what appeared to be stream of consciousness religious writing. Standard delusional material, the kind of thing you might expect from someone undergoing a psychological breakdown. But then Harrison displayed a page that made my breath catch in my throat. It was a precise technical diagram showing concentric circles overlaid with coordinate grids. Numbers ran down the left margin in columns, each entry corresponding to a specific point within the circular pattern. At first glance, it looked like some kind of abstract mathematical exercise, possibly related to their intelligence training. But I recognised the structure immediately. It was identical to the geomagnetic mapping systems we used to predict atmospheric interference with satellite communications. The concentric circles represented zones of electromagnetic field strength, with the coordinates marking specific points where field interactions would be strongest. What made this diagram extraordinary was its precision. The calculations weren't the work of amateurs or delusional individuals. They represented advanced understanding of electromagnetic field theory and geophysical dynamics. Someone with extensive technical training had created this, someone who understood the complex relationships between Earth's magnetic field, atmospheric conditions, and electromagnetic wave propagation. More disturbing were the coordinate references scattered throughout the diagram. I recognised several immediately, known locations of HARP research facilities that wouldn't be publicly acknowledged for several more years. The High-Frequency Active Auroral Research Program was still in its planning stages in 1990, with most details classified at levels far above my clearance. Yet somehow, the Gulf Breeze 6 had obtained not just the locations of future HARP installations, but detailed technical specifications for their intended operations. The subjects claimed these diagrams represented a global communications network, Colonel Harrison continued, supposedly operated by extraterrestrial intelligences in cooperation with shadowy government agencies. Classic paranoid delusion material, but we need to understand how classified location data became incorporated into their fantasies. I wanted to raise my hand to point out that the mathematics in these diagrams were far too sophisticated for delusional rambling, that the coordinates were too accurate to be coincidental. But something in Harrison's tone suggested that questions weren't welcome, that this briefing was more about delivering a message than seeking input. As the slides continued, more patterns emerged. The notebook pages showed detailed analysis of electromagnetic frequency bands, calculations for signal propagation through various atmospheric conditions, and most intriguingly, timelines that correlated specific dates with geomagnetic storm activity. The authors had been tracking the relationship between solar activity, Earth's magnetic field fluctuations, and optimal windows for long-range electromagnetic communication. One page showed a hand-drawn map of the Gulf Coast region, with lines connecting various military installations. Eglin Air Force Base, Naval Air Station Pensacola, and several smaller facilities were marked with symbols that corresponded to specific electromagnetic frequencies. It looked like a plan for coordinated transmission operations, with each facility contributing to a larger network effect. But the most chilling element appeared on the final slides, excerpts from what appeared to be intercepted communications. The text was fragmentary, apparently transcribed from audio recordings. Grid calibration sequence initiating. Subject selection parameters confirmed. Psychological preparation phase entering final stage. Frequency harmonics achieving desired resonance patterns. Brainwave entrainment proceeding within acceptable parameters. Phase transition imminent. Recommend acceleration of timeline to prevent subject awareness breakthrough. Colonel Harrison dismissed these excerpts as examples of how the subjects had incorporated technical language into their delusional system, creating fictional communications that seemed authoritative but were actually meaningless. But I had heard similar language before in the transmission I had intercepted just before the 6 analysts disappeared. The briefing concluded with a standard warning about the importance of reporting signs of psychological instability among personnel with access to classified information. We were reminded that the stress of intelligence work could manifest in various ways, from substance abuse to paranoid ideation, and that early intervention was essential for both operational security and individual welfare. As we filed out of the briefing room, I lingered behind, hoping to get a closer look at the notebook pages. But the materials had already been secured, locked away in containers marked with classification levels I had never seen before. That night I lay awake thinking about those diagrams, those calculations, those impossible coordinates. The Gulf Breeze 6 hadn't been recording delusions or fantasy communications. They had been documenting a real system, a network of electromagnetic installations capable of projecting precisely controlled signals across vast distances. Whatever they had discovered, it was sophisticated enough to require advanced technical knowledge to understand, classified enough to involve multiple government agencies, and dangerous enough that 6 experienced intelligence professionals had risked everything to expose it. The official story painted them as victims of psychological breakdown, but the evidence told a different tale. They had found something that someone very powerful wanted to keep hidden, and they had paid the price for their curiosity. Their notebooks weren't the ravings of delusional minds. They were the field notes of investigators who had uncovered one of the most closely guarded secrets of the modern world. Chapter 5. The Interrogations. In the military justice system, desertion during peacetime typically results in a dishonourable discharge and 1 to 3 years of confinement. During periods of heightened tension like the Cold War's final months, sentences could be much harsher. When I learned that the Gulf Breeze 6 had received sentences of less than 3 months each, I knew something was fundamentally wrong with the official narrative. My access to their court-martial records was limited, but what I could verify through official channels painted a picture of legal proceedings that seemed designed more to contain information than to pursue justice. The trials were held in closed session, with all testimony classified under national security provisions. Defence attorneys were assigned from a very small pool of officers with specialised security clearances, limiting the defendant's ability to choose their own representation. Most unusual was the speed of the entire process. From arrest to sentencing, the cases were resolved in less than 6 weeks, an impossibly fast timeline for military courts dealing with complex desertion charges involving multiple defendants and classified information. But it was the sentencing that really revealed the true nature of what had happened. Vance Davis, the apparent leader of the group, received 85 days confinement. The others received similar sentences, all under 90 days. For comparison, a single soldier caught stealing equipment from a motor pool might face longer imprisonment. Through carefully cultivated relationships with personnel in the military legal system, I was able to learn fragments of what had occurred during the closed proceedings. The testimony apparently focused not on the circumstances of the desertion itself, but on the defendants' mental states and their claims about the reasons for their actions. According to one source, the defendants had attempted to present evidence of what they termed Project Grid, describing an advanced electromagnetic manipulation system capable of influencing human consciousness over large geographic areas. They claim to have documented proof of illegal human experimentation involving the use of military personnel and civilian populations as unwitting test subjects. The prosecution's response was to focus on the defendant's psychological evaluations, presenting expert testimony about stress-induced paranoid ideation and group hysteria. The technical evidence the defendants attempted to present was ruled inadmissible on national security grounds, effectively silencing their primary defence. What struck me as most significant was the prosecution's apparent lack of interest in pursuing maximum penalties. In normal circumstances, military prosecutors approached desertion cases with considerable aggression, viewing them as fundamental challenges to military discipline and order. But in this case, the prosecution seemed more interested in containing the story than in punishment. The light sentences served multiple purposes. They validated the official narrative of psychological breakdown, while avoiding the prolonged appeals process that might have accompanied harsher punishments. They also ensured that the defendants would be released quickly and quietly, reducing the likelihood of continued public attention or media investigation. But perhaps most importantly, the minimal sentences came with extensive conditions. All 6 defendants were required to sign comprehensive non-disclosure agreements as part of their plea arrangements, legally prohibiting them from discussing the circumstances of their desertion or any classified information they claimed to have discovered. Violation of these agreements would result not just in return to military custody, but in federal prosecution under espionage laws. I tried to imagine myself in their position, faced with the choice between years in military prison or a few months of confinement, followed by enforced silence about what they had experienced. For intelligence professionals who had dedicated their careers to uncovering and analysing secrets, the requirement to remain silent about their greatest discovery must have been torture worse than any physical punishment. The speed and coordination of the entire legal process suggested involvement from agencies far above the normal military chain of command. The paperwork I could access showed consultation with Department of Defense officials, National Security Agency representatives, and legal advisors from agencies whose names were completely redacted from the documents. Someone with tremendous influence had decided that the Gulf Breeze 6 needed to be neutralised quickly and quietly, their story buried under layers of classification and psychological evaluation. The legal system had been used not to pursue justice, but to manage a potentially explosive security breach. As I researched the case, I kept returning to the fundamental question. If the 6 defendants were truly delusional, why the elaborate cover-up? Genuine psychological breakdown cases were handled through medical channels, not high-priority legal proceedings involving multiple federal agencies. The resources devoted to containing their story far exceeded what would be necessary for dealing with simple desertion motivated by mental illness. The only logical conclusion was that the Gulf Breeze 6 had discovered something real, something significant enough to warrant intervention from the highest levels of the national security apparatus. Their crime wasn't desertion, it was knowing too much. Their light sentences weren't mercy, they were the price of their silence. Chapter 6. The Signal. January 15th, 1991. I remember the date precisely because it was the day Operation Desert Storm began, and I was pulling a double shift monitoring communications traffic from the Persian Gulf region. The whole base was on high alert, every piece of electronic surveillance equipment focused on the developing conflict in Iraq, which is probably why nobody noticed when I detected the same anomalous signal pattern that had preceded the Gulf Breeze 6 desertion. It started at 0347 hours local time, during a minor geomagnetic storm that was causing intermittent interference with our satellite uplinks. At first, I dismissed the readings as atmospheric noise, just another side effect of solar particle bombardment interacting with Earth's magnetic field. But as I applied filters and signal enhancement techniques, familiar patterns began to emerge from the electronic chaos. Pulse transmissions on extremely low frequencies, organised in clusters of 6, occurring at precise intervals that matched no known military or civilian communication protocols. I immediately began recording everything, using the same procedures I had followed during the original intercepts 6 months earlier. But this time, the signals were stronger, clearer, as if the transmission system had been refined and improved. Instead of the fragmentary voice communications I had detected before, I was receiving what appeared to be complex data streams, digital information encoded in electromagnetic pulses that my equipment could capture but not decode. I worked for 3 hours to clean up the signal, isolating it from background interference and atmospheric noise. Gradually, an extraordinary pattern emerged. The transmission wasn't random data, it was a precisely structured map, consisting of coordinate pairs that corresponded to locations across the Gulf Coast region. When I plotted these coordinates on a map of Florida and southern Alabama, they formed the same concentric circle pattern I had seen in the Gulf Breeze 6 notebooks. The centre point fell exactly on Gulf Breeze itself, with successive rings radiating outward to encompass Pensacola, Eglin Air Force Base, and several smaller communities scattered across the region. More intriguingly, when I overlaid this electromagnetic map with geological surveys of the area, it correlated precisely with local geomagnetic anomalies. The Gulf Coast region sits atop complex mineral deposits and underground geological formations that create natural variations in Earth's magnetic field. The transmission patterns seem designed to exploit these natural electromagnetic characteristics, using them to amplify and focus signals across a much wider area than would normally be possible. I spent the remainder of my shift analysing every aspect of the transmission, using every technical resource available to understand what I was seeing. The mathematical precision was extraordinary. Whoever had designed this system understood geomagnetic field dynamics at a level that surpassed anything in the public scientific literature. But the most disturbing discovery came when I compared the timing of this transmission with reports from Gulf Breeze itself. Local newspapers from the period, which I accessed through base library services, showed a correlation between the electromagnetic signal and reported UFO sightings in the area. The transmission had occurred during the same 6-hour window when multiple residents reported unusual aerial phenomena and strange sounds on radio equipment. The pattern was undeniable. The mysterious signals weren't communications in the traditional sense. They were some form of stimulus designed to trigger specific responses in people within the affected geographic area. The electromagnetic fields were being used to influence human perception, possibly inducing the visual and auditory hallucinations that residents interpreted as extraterrestrial contact. I thought about the Gulf Breeze 6, about their claims of receiving divine or extraterrestrial messages that compelled them to act. What if they hadn't been delusional at all? What if they had simply been more sensitive than most people to the electromagnetic manipulation being conducted in the region? As intelligence professionals, they would have had access to information about unusual signal activity. Their training would have made them naturally suspicious of unexplained phenomena, more likely to investigate rather than simply accept official explanations. If they had begun to suspect that the Gulf Breeze UFO reports were actually the result of military experimentation, their actions made perfect sense. They weren't deserting, they were investigating. They weren't suffering psychological breakdowns. They were responding rationally to evidence of illegal human experimentation. Their month of supposedly aimless travel was actually a comprehensive intelligence gathering operation, documenting the extent and nature of what they had discovered. The light sentences they received weren't mercy for mentally ill soldiers. They were the price of their agreement to remain silent about a classified research program that used American civilians as unwitting test subjects. Over the following months, I continued monitoring the frequencies associated with the Gulf Breeze signals, documenting every transmission and analysing the patterns that emerged. The system appeared to operate on a regular schedule, with intensive activity periods followed by weeks or months of silence. Each active period coincided with reported anomalous phenomena in the Gulf Coast region, not just UFO sightings, but unexplained power outages, compass deviations, and reports of strange sounds and physical sensations among local residents. I was documenting evidence of the most sophisticated psychological operations program in human history, a system capable of manipulating the perceptions and behaviours of entire populations through precisely controlled electromagnetic fields. The implications were staggering, not just for military applications, but for understanding the fundamental relationship between electromagnetic fields and human consciousness. But I was also documenting evidence of a massive violation of constitutional rights, scientific ethics, and international law. American citizens were being used as test subjects in classified experiments without their knowledge or consent, their minds manipulated by technologies they couldn't understand or defend against. The Gulf Breeze 6 had tried to expose this system, and they had been neutralised through the military justice system and enforced silence. Now I faced the same choice they had confronted: remain silent and complicit, or risk everything to bring the truth to light. For the moment I chose documentation over action, building a comprehensive record of everything I observed while trying to understand the full scope of what I had discovered. But I knew that eventually I would have to decide whether to follow the example of 6 brave intelligence professionals who had sacrificed their careers to expose one of the darkest secrets of the modern world. Chapter 7. The Warning. September the 3rd, 1991. The letter arrived at my quarters in a standard military envelope. My name and address typed on a manual typewriter, no return address. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a message that made my hands tremble. Mr. Kellerman, we have never met, but we serve the same cause. The signals you have been monitoring are not what they appear to be. It wasn't God. It wasn't aliens. It was the grid. They're tuning it, and we weren't supposed to know. Stop looking before you join us. V.D. Vance Davis. The leader of the Gulf Breeze 6 was reaching out to me, somehow aware that I was continuing to investigate the electromagnetic phenomena that had destroyed his life and career. But how could he know what I was doing? I'd never discussed my research with anyone, never filed reports about my discoveries, never taken any action that should have attracted attention, unless the same system that had influenced him and his colleagues was also monitoring me. I examined the envelope carefully, looking for postmarks, routing stamps, or any other indicators of origin. The letter had been mailed from Pensacola, Florida, less than a week earlier. Davis was apparently still in the Gulf Coast region, despite having completed his military sentence months ago. The timing was significant. My most recent intercept of the grid signals had occurred just 10 days before the letter arrived, during a period of intensive electromagnetic activity that had coincided with reports of power grid failures and unexplained atmospheric phenomena across northern Florida. If Davis was somehow monitoring the system's activities, he would know when I was most likely to be conducting my own surveillance. But the most disturbing aspect of his message wasn't what he said, but what he implied. Stop looking before you join us suggested that the 6 weren't simply former military personnel living under court-imposed silence. They were still involved somehow, still connected to whatever system they had tried to expose. Over the following weeks, I found myself questioning everything about the official narrative. What if the Gulf Breeze 6 hadn't been released after their sentences? What if the brief confinements were just the beginning of their involvement with whatever agency was running the grid project? Intelligence professionals with their level of clearance and technical expertise would be invaluable assets for any classified research program. Instead of simply silencing them, it would make far more sense to recruit them, to use their knowledge and abilities to improve and expand the very system they had tried to expose. Their desertion might have been the cover story for their recruitment into a special access program, so classified that their participation couldn't be acknowledged even within normal intelligence channels. Their public disgrace and imprisonment would provide perfect cover for their continued involvement in activities that officially didn't exist. I began researching the post-military lives of the 6 former analysts, using the same information networks I had employed to track their movements during the original incident. What I discovered was a pattern of carefully orchestrated obscurity. All 6 had supposedly found civilian employment after their military service ended, but their employment records were strangely incomplete. Database searches turned up fragmentary information, employment with defence contractors whose primary clients were classified agencies, residential addresses that led to mail forwarding services, financial records that showed regular income from sources identified only by numerical codes. They appeared to be living normal post-military lives while simultaneously existing in a carefully constructed shadow world that kept their actual activities hidden from public view. It was exactly the kind of deep cover arrangement used for personnel involved in programs too sensitive for normal oversight. 3 weeks after receiving Davis's letter, I found my answer in the most tragic way possible. The Pensacola News Journal carried a brief article on page 4. Former military man dies in auto accident. Vance Davis, age 34, had been killed when his car left the road during a rainstorm and struck a tree. No other vehicles involved, no indication of mechanical failure, no evidence of alcohol or drug impairment. Just another unfortunate traffic fatality that merited 2 paragraphs in the local newspaper. But the timing was impossible to ignore. Davis had contacted me exactly 24 days before his death, warning me to stop investigating the grid signals. Now he was dead, and his warning carried implications that chilled me to the bone. I requested leave time and drove to Pensacola to attend the funeral, hoping to learn more about Davis's final months, and possibly to make contact with other members of the Gulf Breeze Six. What I found instead was a carefully staged event that raised more questions than it answered. The funeral was held at a small chapel near Naval Air Station Pensacola, attended by fewer than 20 people. I recognised none of them as military personnel, despite Davis's years of service and the strong bonds typically formed between intelligence professionals. The mourners appeared to be local civilians, people who might have known Davis during his brief time in the area, but who seemed unfamiliar with his military background. Most tellingly, none of the other 5 members of the Gulf Breeze Six attended their former leader's funeral. Given their shared experience and the bonds that would have formed during their month of investigation and subsequent trials, their absence was inexplicable unless they had been prevented from attending, or were no longer free to make such choices. After the service, I approached the funeral director to express my condolences and hopefully learn more about Davis's final months. What he told me confirmed my worst suspicions. Davis had been living in Pensacola under an assumed identity, working as a civilian contractor for an unnamed government agency. His work required frequent travel and extended absences, during which he couldn't be reached even by emergency contact. The funeral director had been contacted not by family members, but by a representative from a private security firm that specialised in handling arrangements for government personnel involved in sensitive assignments. The picture that emerged was of a man living in enforced isolation, cut off from his former life and colleagues, working on projects he couldn't discuss with anyone. His death, whether accidental or intentional, had eliminated the one member of the Gulf Breeze Six who had retained enough independence to reach out to others investigating the grid phenomenon. I left Pensacola that evening knowing that I had received my final warning: continue investigating, and I would likely share Davis's fate. Remain silent, and I would become complicit in a program that violated every principle I had sworn to defend. Chapter 8. The Present Day. 33 years have passed since the Gulf Breeze Six vanished from their posts in Germany, and I am now an old man haunted by knowledge I was never supposed to possess. I retired from military service in 1994, spent 2 decades working as a civilian communications consultant, and tried to convince myself that the secrets I carried were buried safely in the past. But the grid never stopped humming. Gulf Breeze still experiences unexplained phenomena. The UFO sightings continue, though they receive less media attention now. Local residents report the same electronic interference, the same mysterious power outages, the same compass deviations that characterised the town during the 1990s. The frequency and intensity seem to follow patterns that suggest ongoing experimentation rather than natural phenomena. More significantly, similar reports have begun appearing from other locations around the world. Small communities near military installations, usually in areas with unusual geological characteristics, experience brief periods of anomalous activity followed by months or years of normalcy. The pattern suggests a global network of grid installations, each capable of generating precisely controlled electromagnetic effects within limited geographic areas. In 2019, I finally gained access to some of the recordings I had made during my service at Gablingen Station, materials that had been classified for nearly 3 decades. Modern digital analysis techniques revealed details in those old intercepts that I had missed during the original investigation. Buried beneath layers of static and interference, almost inaudible even with the best enhancement software, were voices repeating a phrase I had never noticed before. Not 6. Not 6. Not 6. The implication was staggering. The Gulf Breeze. 6 weren't the only intelligence personnel who had discovered the grid project. There should have been more, either additional analysts who had made the same discoveries or other personnel who had been recruited into the program from the beginning. But only 6 had been publicly exposed. Only 6 had been court-martialed and silenced. The phrase suggested that others had been handled differently, either eliminated quietly or recruited successfully enough that their disappearances never attracted attention. I began researching other cases of military personnel who had gone missing or died under suspicious circumstances during the same time period. What I found was a pattern of isolated incidents that, when viewed together, suggested a systematic effort to control information about advanced electromagnetic research programs. Between 1989 and 1992, more than 30 intelligence personnel assigned to communications monitoring duties had either died in accidents, transferred to classified assignments, or simply vanished from official records. All had security clearances that would have given them access to the kind of intercept data I had been analysing. All had been stationed at facilities involved in satellite communications or electronic surveillance. The Gulf Breeze 6 were the only ones who had managed to investigate and attempt to expose what they had discovered. The others had been neutralised through more direct means, their disappearances scattered across multiple agencies and geographic locations to prevent anyone from recognising the pattern. I realised that my own survival had depended on factors I hadn't understood at the time. My role as a signals technician had been considered too junior to pose a serious threat. My research had been conducted carefully enough to avoid triggering automated security monitoring systems, and perhaps most importantly, Davis's warning had convinced me to limit my activities to passive observation rather than active investigation. But my silence had come at a cost. For 3 decades, I had allowed a program of illegal human experimentation to continue, knowing that American citizens were being used as unwitting test subjects in research that violated every ethical and legal standard of civilized society. Now, in what may be my final years, I have decided to break that silence. This account represents everything I know about the Gulf Breeze 6 and the electromagnetic manipulation system they died trying to expose. I have documented sources for every claim, provided copies of all available evidence, and prepared detailed technical analyses that confirm the existence of technologies far beyond anything publicly acknowledged. The GRID project represents more than just advanced military research. It demonstrates the development of weapons capable of manipulating human consciousness itself, technologies that could be used to control populations, influence elections, or suppress dissent through means that victims couldn't recognise or defend against. The Gulf Breeze 6 weren't deserters who abandoned their posts in a moment of psychological crisis. They were investigators who discovered evidence of crimes against humanity and died trying to expose them. Their month of supposed wandering was actually a sophisticated intelligence operation that gathered proof of illegal experimentation on American citizens. Their light sentences weren't mercy for mentally ill soldiers. They were the price of recruitment into the very program they had tried to expose. Their subsequent deaths and disappearances weren't coincidental. They were the systematic elimination of witnesses to one of the most classified research programs in modern history. The official story of religious delusion and UFO obsession was a carefully constructed cover narrative designed to discredit their discoveries and prevent serious investigation of their claims. The truth is far more sinister. They had uncovered evidence of a technological capability that could reshape the fundamental relationship between government and citizen. For 33 years, I've lived with the knowledge that American citizens continue to be subjected to illegal experimentation, their minds manipulated by electromagnetic fields they cannot detect or understand. The Gulf Coast region remains an active test site, with Gulf Breeze serving as the primary focus for research into population-level consciousness manipulation. The Gulf Breeze 6 weren't victims of psychological breakdown. They were heroes who sacrificed everything to expose a program that threatens the very foundations of human freedom and dignity. Their story deserves to be told, their sacrifice remembered, and their investigation completed. The grid still hums beneath our feet, in Gulf Breeze and dozens of other locations around the world. The technology that killed 6 brave intelligence professionals continues to develop, growing more sophisticated and more dangerous with each passing year. Their deaths will only have meaning if we finish what they started. The truth about the grid project must be exposed, the illegal experimentation must be stopped, and those responsible must be held accountable for crimes that span decades and continue to this day. The Gulf Breeze 6 weren't deserters, they were defectors, from a reality being tuned beneath our feet, and their defection was the most patriotic act any of them ever performed.